组的2月份会议。本次会议将提供英语、西班牙语、普通话的双向同声传译，以提供语言方面的便利。只有在这个提示被连续翻译成每种语言之后，翻译球才会出现。当这个像地球仪这样子的翻译球出现的时候，我们请你参加这一次活动的每一个人选择自己喜欢的语言，以方便清楚地听到演讲者和与会者的声音，并防止在没有选择的情况之下出现技术方面的故障，或者是3种语言之间的干扰。如果您使用的是笔记型电脑，可以在萤幕底端找到一个像
So moving on. Now, in response to feedback from the public, we will be opening public comment at the beginning of the meeting for agenda item 1, so there may be more time to respond. During this first round, members of the public are welcome to provide written public comment on the first agenda item through Google Forms. As a reminder, to ensure that we adhere to Bagley-Keene, workgroup members can only respond to comments that pertain to items covered in the agenda. In response to public comment at the last meeting, we have made some adjustments to our public comment process. The Google form has been translated to include Spanish and Mandarin, enhancing accessibility for non-English speaking communities engaging with us today. We've compiled all of the links for Google Forms, Discourse, and the California Educators Together site. On Google Forms, the public can submit written public comments to the workgroup. On Discourse, the public can observe the written dialogue between workgroup members and presenters. And on the California Educators Together site, the public can access all workgroup materials. To access the page that contains all the links to the platforms mentioned, scan the QR code on the slide or enter the URL GROUP.com/UPK in your web browser. To submit your public comment, you will need to enter your name on the Google form. All public comments will be posted and available for everyone to see, both as your comments come up on Google Forms and after the meeting as part of the public record. We kindly ask that you uphold standards of professionalism. This slide is pinned to make it easy for everyone to access the public comment. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Shanna Burkholz-Vasquez from the CDE.
Thank you, Sienna. As Sienna mentioned, my name is Shanna Burkholz-Vasquez, and I'm the administrator of the UPK Implementation and Support Office within the Early Education Division at the California Department of Education. I want to extend a warm welcome to the March Universal Pre-Kindergarten Mixed Delivery Quality and Access Workgroup meeting. Enhancing access to high-quality kindergarten, pre-K, for California's youngest learners requires diverse voices and robust engagement. Reflecting on the breadth and depth of discussion so far from our work group and the robust public comment, it is clear we have a remarkable group of people here supporting and informing our ability to make recommendations that will be most impactful to our earliest learners. We look forward to continuing to learn from your experiences, as well as working with the work group members, state partners, the staff at CDE, and members of the public, and working towards recommendations. Through our collective efforts, we will move closer towards ensuring that California's 3- and 4-year-old children have increased access to high quality and equitable pre-K learning experiences. On that note, we want to make clear the statutory charge outlined for this group. This group is charged with first, providing recommendations on best practices for increasing access to high quality universal pre-K programs for 3 and 4-year-old children offered through a mixed delivery model that provides equitable learning experiences across a variety of settings. Second, providing recommendations to update pre-K standards pursuant to Ed Code Section 8203 to support equitable access to high quality pre-K and transitional kindergarten programs through the mixed delivery model and across all appropriate settings and funding sources. 3, and overarching both of the above, ensuring recommendations are in alignment with the work of the master plan, without recommending new system changes that create increased state or local costs to offer pre-K across the mixed delivery system. This charge was outlined as part of the steps towards implementing the administration's master plan for early learning and care, specifically in Objective 3, which states, promote school readiness through pre-K for all 3-year-old children experiencing poverty and universally for all 4-year-old children. The legislature focused the scope of this work group on pre-K age children and the education standards that govern preschool programs to align with the master plan recommendations. To be explicit, the work group is charged with recommending changes to the Title V program standards that govern CSPP, general childcare, and FCCs that are contracted through a fetching to offer CSPP and general childcare in home-based settings. This work group serves as advisors for the CDE and the state partners as CDE develops a report to the legislature and Department of Finance on increasing access to and quality standards for high quality pre-K programs. Now, I want to take a minute to outline where we are and how we hope to structure our time together over the next year. So we started our work by exploring and understanding the landscape. We'll continue this through April. Next, we're moving into a deep dive to unpack and identify barriers in May, June, and July, and then uncover and identify solutions in October, September, October, and November. Finally, we'll move into the report development and refinement period in December, January, and February. In March of 2024, a year from now, or shortly thereafter, we'll plan to have a presentation on the final report of the work group's recommendations. In the coming weeks, GPG will post a timeline indicating when we anticipate sharing an outline of the CDE's report to the legislature and Department of Finance for work group member feedback. The timeline will also include when the work group will advise and offer comments on an outline and drafts, and when the public will have an opportunity to comment and submit their feedback. Now that we've regrounded our purpose, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the shoulders we stand on as we conduct this work together. March is Women's History Month. I want to welcome Mary Vixie Sandy, the Executive Director of the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, to make some remarks about the contributions of the early education workforce, acknowledging the uncompensated and undervalued efforts of women, specifically women of color, in our preschool settings.
Thank you so much, Shanna, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you again. So during Women's History Month, it's important that we celebrate the significant impact women have had on the early childhood education landscape. Women in the United States and globally have always been integral to the education of our youngest learners, whether in formalized institutions like schools or in the home. Today, we stand on the shoulders of the many wonderful women who have laid the foundation of early childhood education as we know it. Women like Susan Blow, who pioneered the first public kindergarten in the United States, and Dr. Evelyn Moore, an advocate for quality early learning experiences, especially for Black children and communities. We also stand on the shoulders of generations of women, particularly women of color, who were instrumental and often uncompensated in educating and nurturing our youngest learners, ensuring children learned and thrived. Without the dedication and commitment of these women and their tenacious advocacy for better recognition of their work, we would not be where we are today. As we continue to strive to answer their call to action and make improvements in our early learning systems, let us remember their sacrifices and celebrate their accomplishments as we approach this work group's charge. Before I hand it back to Shauna, I would like to just appreciate the opportunity as a state agency partner in this work to collaborate with and learn from everyone in this space with an orientation toward a child-centered approach to progress when it comes to preschool access and quality, and how this all fits into the bigger educational teacher system. Shanna, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That's such a powerful, amazing statement. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that March is also Developmental Disability Awareness Month. So much of what we seek to do in this space is to create a more inclusive preschool environment for our 3 and 4-year-old children. I'm pleased to welcome Barbara Boyd, who is the administrator of the Early Childhood Support Unit. The Early Childhood Support Unit works with the education's Early Education Division to support inclusive practices and increase inclusive classrooms. Barbara will speak to the importance of a focus on inclusion and our work together.
Hello, everyone. The importance of inclusion in early childhood education can't be overstated. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about that in front of this work group during Developmental Disability Awareness Month. By the way, wear your orange this month. Inclusion is first and foremost a social justice issue. We can all agree that all children, regardless of disability, ethnicity, geography, and income, deserve a high-quality education. This is of considerable importance in children's earliest interactions with education, whether it is pre-K or TK. Historically, in this country, inclusion has not been a priority in the design and implementation of our educational system. There are barriers to accessing high-quality education for children with disabilities and their families, including physical inaccessibility, a lack of individualization, and uninformed or negative attitudes towards disabilities in general. These barriers have become baked into the broader education system, and while California has made strides towards increasing equity and inclusion, there's always more we can do to ensure that our children have access to high-quality educational experiences. In this work group, you have a unique opportunity to make recommendations that expand the inclusion of children with disabilities, ensuring that universal pre-K in California is truly universal, accessible, and high quality for all learners. The California Department of Education strives to support learners with disabilities at all levels. In early education specifically, we have the Inclusive Early Education Expansion Program, which provides grant funding to LEAs to support children with disabilities, hold inclusive education workshops, and provides resources for how to best serve our learners with disabilities. Specific to this work group's charge, California's Master Plan for Early Learning and Care includes goals that align with the inclusion of children with disabilities. Aligned goals include increasing opportunities for 3 and 4-year-old children to access high-quality inclusive environments. It includes enhancing educator competencies to increase their effectiveness with all children and increase their ability to address children's unique learning needs, including children with exceptional needs. And it includes developing approaches to align policy and practices from birth through grade 3 for engaging local leadership and developing frameworks for effective transition periods. It is important that this work group continues to include children with disabilities in your child-centered approach, and that there is special attention to intersectionality and considering how quality and access recommendations align for children with disabilities who may also be part of other marginalized groups. Now, I look forward to seeing the recommendations this work group puts forward and to continuing to work with leaders across California's educational landscape to strengthen our early learning system for our youngest learners with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. CDE is committed to inclusion and are grateful to the workgroup members and members of the public that elevated the importance of centering our learners with disabilities as we move toward a more equitable and accessible UPK system. Now, I want to briefly review our objectives for today. The workgroup will explore the following questions through presentations, discussions, and public comment. First, what is the current status of quality, both standards and practice, within California's mixed delivery model? Also, what is the current distribution of programs across California, and how does this vary across the state? And finally, what are the barriers families face in assessing high-quality universal preschool programs defined by statute as those meeting educational Title V standards for 3- and 4-year-old children? How can these barriers be addressed? We know we will only begin to scratch the surface of these questions today, but we're looking forward to unpacking these important topics for the work group over the next year. Now I'm going to hand it over to Erin Price at GPG to provide a recap from last month.
Great, thanks so much, Shanna. I'm Erin Price, everybody, and I'm president at the Glenn Price Group at GPG, as Shanna just mentioned. And I'd like to just begin with a reminder of the law that stipulates the structure of these work group meetings. This work group is governed by the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act. Bagley-Keene requires that the public has a seat at the table when the work group meets to gather information, to deliberate, or make a decision. Workgroup members can only deliberate issues in front of the public and on items listed on the agenda. We are currently in the first public comment period, as mentioned earlier, which will close at approximately 1:20, and you can access that through the link to the landing page shared previously, as well as the QR code that should be visible under Emily Esteban's video feed there. Materials on the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act are available on the California Educators Together website, which brings me to the next reminder. We encourage all workgroup members and members of the public to visit the UPK Mixed Delivery Quality and Access Workgroup group on the California Educators Together, or CET, website. This is the platform that we have been using and will continue to use to share information and materials related to the workgroup, both with members of the workgroup and members of the public. CET is free and open to the public, and the materials on the CET website are accessible without having to create or log into an account. Materials that are formally introduced at a workgroup meeting will be available on CET in the days preceding each meeting for both the workgroup members and the public to review in advance of the meeting. I'd really also like to pause for a moment and underscore the importance of workgroup members specifically reviewing materials on CET before the meeting as a way to allow us to engage in some more detailed discussion of those materials during the meetings and to prioritize meeting time for discussion over the initial presentation and delivery of information. We will be experimenting with providing more and more recorded video presentations for review in advance of the meetings, as we did for today's meeting. And we'll be counting on work group members to review those materials, those recorded presentations, before we come together. Finally, I would like to point out that there's a section of CET with foundational documents, such as a list of Title V quality standards that were referenced earlier, that you should be sure to review if you haven't had an opportunity to do so already. The link to the California Educators Together website is on the landing page that my colleague Sienna Chambers introduced at the beginning of the meeting. And there's also a link, short link on the screen here. As a reminder, we also have an inbox, UPK Mixed Delivery Workgroup at glenpricegroup.com. If you need any technical assistance, we will be monitoring that inbox throughout the meeting. Now I'd like to move to a brief recap of our last meeting. And as we continue through these discussions with the work group and receiving input from the public, we want to make sure to carry forward themes, threads of discussion, topics that we need to continue incorporating into these meetings. So as a reminder, in February, we continued to build our shared understanding of the universal pre-K, the UPK landscape, with presentations from Catalyst California, from Child Trends, from NEAR, and from MDRC. And these presentations helped us to learn about parent perspectives on quality in early education, about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how these topics are central to the work group's charge. And we also started to learn about other state models of implementing high-quality mixed delivery pre-K. Workgroup members responded to and helped to analyze what we heard from presenters, both verbally and in writing through discourse. Some of the notable themes emerging from workgroup discussions included the importance of inclusion and considering learners with disabilities in this work. And Barbara shared some powerful statements earlier as we celebrate Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month and think about how those efforts relate to this work. Workgroup members also elevated the importance of ensuring culturally affirming and responsive pre-K programs, the need for aligning standards to ensure that children in different settings receive the same quality of education and preparation, and some discussion of consistency around what preparation for kindergarten looks like. There were some workforce considerations that came up as well, particularly in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion, both as it relates to the importance of supporting the workforce to best support students with disabilities, as well as ways to support diversity, equity, and inclusion within the workforce itself. And there was also a desire that was shared by some members of the work group for more California specific and also for some more regional data and research on the state's pre-K landscape and on child outcomes. The work group and members of the public also asked some clarifying questions about the work group's charge, specifically about the piece of the charge where the work group is looking at the quality standards found in section 8203 of Title V, as Shanna presented earlier, and how this relates to transitional kindergarten. We'll be revisiting these clarifying questions and considerations at a future meeting. We also heard some additional themes through the public comment, and specifically a few of those were the inclusion and role of family childcare homes in the mixed delivery model, some concerns about the continuation of systemic inequities among educators and providers, and equity and inclusion of all students across all settings. Some of these ideas mirroring closely the ideas of work group members. At the last meeting, we saw data from other states about observed differences in development in children entering pre-K in community-based organizations or community-based settings as compared to LEAs or school-based settings. This was part of the NEAR and MDRC presentation. This research also showed, in addition to differences in development of the students entering those programs, showed different child outcomes by setting. And this research helps us to uncover potential trust gaps and also potential practice gaps. Additionally, we saw research that showed significant improvement in preschool practice when targeted support strategies were employed to meet program and setting specific needs. Finally, we heard clearly from members of the work group that the child-centered orientation that has come up throughout our meetings to date, and that the work group continues to bring to this endeavor, and recognize that being child-centered means not shying away from the opportunity to do better, and that we have an opportunity to look at both what's working well and an opportunity to unpack what's not working in our current preschool policy and practice ecosystem as a means of working toward policies, practices, and investments that support high-quality preschool programs across the mixed delivery system. We'll continue to explore these threads and these topics of consideration today, highlighting specifically parent perspectives on high-quality education, current preschool standards across settings, including veterans, and part of the current preschool program landscape in California. With that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Maggie Stakely, who you all know from previous meetings, who will turn the focus of the group to further unpacking some of what we've reflected on to date, specifically looking at one of our group norms, staying child-centered, building on that last note that I shared. And we'll reflect on how the work will benefit children by asking, how will children be better off because of this decision? We also want to encourage the work group to lean into conversation and dialogue as much as possible as these public meeting platforms will allow, and encourage you all to go back and forth on discourse to help us go deeper and to continue the conversation in writing through discourse comments as well as verbally in the meeting. Maggie, over to you to take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. It's great to be with everyone today again. And as we continue to support the work group at UPG, we want to think about ways to develop tools to co-construct a child-centered approach to making recommendations in line with our scope. So last month, the group looked at a tool to think about child-centered decision-making. And this month, we want to unpack that idea even more. The work group is tasked with recommendations to the CDE around access and to quality standards for high-quality preschool programs for 3- and 4-year-old children. We would like you to reflect on the following questions. What does a child-centered approach to making recommendations mean to you? And what does a child-centered policy ecosystem look like? We invite you as workgroup members to raise your hand to make verbal comments or to use the discourse platform to share your reflections. As a reminder to all workgroup members and members of the public, you can scan the pinned QR code that's both on the slides and showing up on the videos to find the places where you can participate. So there is a link to the discourse platform that workgroup members can enter their comments on. There is also a link for members of the public to see those discourse comments. And we are still in our first public comment phase, so you can also make public comment through that QR code as well. So with that, I invite our workgroup members to raise their hand or begin sharing any reflections on what this idea of a child-centered approach or a child-centered policy ecosystem looks like. And Caitlin, could I ask you to go back to the last slide as well, just so we could see that graphic to maybe start our thinking off. Gina, Dr. Gina Firmware, I see you've got your hand raised. Would you like to start us off today?
Yeah, to start us off with a bigger picture around this and how I think about it, and how my organization is really beginning to think about it more holistically. And that children live in families, families live in communities, communities live in cities, the cities belong to our state, and that there is an intersectionality across all of these entities to support and make sure the child has what it needs to be successful. There's a lot to that, but I think a lot of times we often go, we go heavy in one zone without the other. And I think looking at a more holistic whole child, whole family approach, you really are trying to engage all of those entities. Maybe, for example, the city looking at policies or bills that support the overall ecosystem. Maybe in communities, creating more family child care centers so there is more availability of slots so families can have more access, right? The state, of course, the state doing what it's doing now, looking at systems of care for UPK, and of course the family having access and understanding of how to move across these ecosystems, because at the core of everything of all of this is a child that will benefit when these systems work well. So that's how I kind of look at it more holistically. So I just wanted to start it off that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Verma. Really appreciate those remarks. And just as a quick reminder, if we would love to display your video as you're talking. And so if you want to come off video when you make your remarks, we would love to see you. And with that, I'll ask Melissa Bunch to jump in.
Hi, everyone. So I just think it's really important when we talk about a child-centered approach to think about the whole child and really keep in mind the family of the children, the different people the child interacts with, and also where our importance is when we're talking about a universal preschool system. Are we placing importance, let's say, on the macro economy of the child? So are we looking at the money that they have, the time they have, the time the parent can spend with the child, or is the parent working 80 hours, double full times in order to make ends meet and not have any time with their child? Or are we looking at something more in the neurodivergent community? Is that where our importance lies? Are we looking at coaches and therapists and early interventionalists and all of those other things that affect not only the child, but the family as a whole? Does the family have time to, rely on these resources, or does the family have even access to these resources? So I think when we're talking about a child-centered approach, we really need to look at the entire family unit, the whole child, and really see what the demographics are in each community and how we can apply that sort of approach when we make decisions in those specific communities. So very much an approach that includes the community as a whole, I think would be very important to look at as well.
Thanks, Melissa. You're making really good points and raising some really good ideas of things that we can start to look at when we get into recommendations on these standards. So appreciate that. I'd like to call on Dr. Deirdre Jones to join us next.
Hi, yes, good afternoon. Want to kind of extend more on what's been said about the ecological model and approach to child-centeredness, and just advising that we go back to the basics of child development and the theorists. I think sometimes, we've been in child development for so long that we forget the theorists, but going back to Uri Brofenbrenner's ecological model and realizing that there are different systems, as some have already been said. The model that you have up right now, that shows part of that ecological model. That's kind of just the micro system there. But as Dr. Fromer said, you have communities that are involved and that affect the child as well. So we need to look at the macro and exosystems as well. With being child-centered, as the definition on the screen says, it's supporting the children's experience by improving the circumstances of families and educators. We really have to look at helping families as an approach to whole child or child-centered, because if the family is experiencing things, that can affect the child's well-being in the classroom. So if they are having food insecurity, or they are without employment, we should do what we can to connect them to the resources to help improve their situation. And that way we are also helping the child to improve in the classroom. And so we really need to lend to that to make sure that when we're talking about child-centered, that we're also including the families. And then also making sure that in the classroom, that we take a developmentally appropriate approach to how we instruct children, and making sure that we do maintain those low ratios, and we don't just start off with low ratios and then in an attempt to serve more children, we pack more children into the classroom. There really should be a cutoff that, even if we add more teachers to it, to maintain the ratio, still having 25, 30 preschoolers in a classroom, even if you have 3 or 4 teachers, that's still too many children in the classroom.
Dr. Jones, really appreciate those remarks, highlighting kind of this, the remarks that Dr. Fromer made, this kind of ecosystem model, kind of picking up on the threads around that intersectionality among these different layers that we want to be thinking about. And I also heard Dr. Jones start to highlight some of the ways that the scope of this work group can reflect what we want in a child-centered approach in terms of thinking about families and the supports that they need. So I would make a call to the work group members to always be thinking about, within this frame of our access and quality standards charge, what does this child-centered approach mean, and how do we use our levers as a work group to bring us there? We're going to go to Jennifer, Tony, and then Nancy in the queue. So Jennifer, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I just kind of wanted to piggyback on what Dr. Fromer was saying, and that for me, with like the policy and just kind of looking at things, equitable doesn't necessarily always mean the same, and keeping that frame of reference in mind, that when we're developing policies and looking at the approaches, that it's not a one-stop shop for everyone or every ecosystem or every city or every community. And so making sure that when we are developing these policies and looking towards how it's going to impact our state, making sure we're not creating a one size or a one fit model, but kind of looking at that equitable approach. And some may get more, some may get less, but we're really reaching the needs of what is needed within those areas. And so that's kind of really what is at the forefront of my mind, is that it doesn't all have to be the same. And so kind of working towards creating policies that would support all of our families and all of our learners all throughout.
Thanks, Jennifer. Before I hand it over to Nancy, I see one hand up from members of the public, and I remind members of the public that if you would like to participate in this conversation, you can follow the QR code that's on your screen. And Nancy, I hand it over to you. Oh, pardon me, I'm sorry. I think I said I was going to Tony next, so forgive me for getting out of order. Tony and then Nancy.
No problem, thanks. Good afternoon. Just to not to echo what my esteemed colleagues have already said, but I think boiling this down real, simplistically, child-centered really has to be focused on what are the intentions, impacts, and outcomes of those experiences, those services that we're looking at providing to young children. So when I think child-centered, it's focused on that. What is our intention? What is the impact to a child? And it has to be holistic in our approach and developmentally appropriate. And I think in our work group, we'll be starting to look at other components and pieces in terms of the ecosystem and the other systems that can impact, right, the experience of a child. But just starting at this basic level, it's really looking at, is the child better off? What does this program or service, how does that improve the child's life? What's the experience and the trajectory change that our intentions or might be impacted by what we're talking about in this design of access and quality. So it really has to be looking at things through the lens of the child and the experience and the outcome. Oftentimes, systems and services are designed around the adults supporting the programs and services and systems. And that's quite frankly the wrong approach. It has to start with who the crux of the service and service is going to be intended for, and what's the impact on that individual, that human, whether they're 3 or 4 years old or younger. So I think that's what it means to me in terms of how we look at this.
Thanks so much, Tony. I really love that very clear frame you gave us. Intentions, impact, outcomes. Really helpful. We'll go to Nancy, then we'll hear from Gloria and Samantha, at which point we'll close the verbal workgroup comment on this topic, but we invite you to continue to participate in discourse.
This is Nancy Hirota. So I'm reflecting on my years earlier in working directly and overseeing and working with our preschool families, educators, and the community. And the first thing that comes to mind for me when I see child-centered approach, that for me, it's looking at that whole child approach, which means we're not only looking at and supporting children's cognitive development, but just as importantly, we're looking at their social emotional development, their physical development, looking at their nutritional needs, and particularly in these early years, looking at their health needs as well. And what that means for me is it's not only important to work with our families, but as others have mentioned, that it's important to embrace the community and to access and leverage all of the assets that exist in our community to provide the range of supports and services that are needed. And I do want to echo another comment made by another colleague on this work group, and that is, as we look at community needs, we absolutely have to take into consideration the variation in terms of the needs of the community. And for those higher need communities where we know more services are needed, the policies and all of the systems that we put in place have to take into consideration that there are some communities that will need much more to ensure that the children are supported in all the ways that are needed. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Nancy. I think I hear you lending support to Jennifer's reminder that equity does not mean the same, and that we need to be constantly looking at that in our charge of this work group. Gloria, to you.
Thank you. And I couldn't have asked to follow up another colleague, Nancy, by just really kind of underscoring, I think, the importance of when we talk about child-centered, I think the question that I want us to keep in front and center is which children, actually having a picture of the demographics of the children who it is we're trying to center policies around, right? And I think that that's a very critical and often not as explicitly delineated. Children in this state are not white, predominantly not white, and they are predominantly not English dominant children. And if those are the children we want at the center, right? I'm not sure it often is, right? And so I really invite us to be laser focused on whose children and which community those children, which families and which communities those children are. Because if we do that, then I think Tony's point, Jennifer's point, Dr. Fromer's point will then follow, that the policies will actually mean differentiated approaches and importantly, differentiated investments. And I will just end with us thinking that we are excited to expand this opportunity of universality in a way that's equitable to a system that is not equitable. And so I think the calling for us is really to challenge ourselves to build an equitable point of entry by being focused on the demographics of the children who we want to be centered when we expand universality of education and access and opportunity to a group of children and a group of families and a group of community that we know now are not centered today And that's our aspiration, I think our challenge for this group, which I know everyone here embraces and understands, but I wanted to make sure that we don't lose track of which children are we centering? Who are you thinking about? And that picture is one that reflects the demographics of our state, not just where it is now, but where we anticipate it being 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and that our funding allocations, our policy decisions and recommendations reflect those children, those communities, and those families.
Thanks, Gloria. We're going to give Samantha Thompson the last verbal word on this topic before we transition, but appreciate all of the public comment and discourse comments that we're seeing come in. Samantha, to you.
Yeah, so I'm grateful for the opportunity, I think, to even follow up behind Gloria's comments, and just want to elaborate on my comment and discourse that child-centered policy ecosystem really needs to be asset framed across the system in terms of thinking about the students that we are prioritizing, and really think about how we approach this work instead of trying to like fix or save these problems that we feel like have been created, but really begin to think about how we create more opportunity by building an aspiration for the children that we're seeking to create these impacts for. And I really struggle a little bit when I read this definition, the words on the screen make sense, but as I look at the bullets on the side, in terms of like developing common language definition and frameworks for achieving the work group scope, I think it's super important that when we're talking about what being child-centered would look like in terms of the experiences of families and educators and children, as well as policies, that we don't do a disservice to this work by simply beginning to change the words that we have continued to use over time. So again, just like uplifting that when we say asset framing across cultural groups, how are we actually using data to begin to tell the truth about what information or tell the truth about what is blocking the movement for these positive outcomes, and really thinking about when we're developing common language and definition, like what does it mean to be better off? How do we define that? How do we measure that? And I think we can all agree that in the early learning and care space, we don't do a good job of looking at the data, but looking at the other side of the data to actually tell the story about what's happening for, to Gloria's point, the majority of children that is that we're trying to support. So.
Thanks, Samantha. And I hear you picking up on a thread that I heard Gloria raise, which is around data and how a child-centered policy ecosystem is one that looks at data, targeted data, and unpacks that. And so I hear you, the work group members making that call. We're going to start looking at some data today, and we'll be thinking about more ways that we can continue to do that intentionally with this group. So thank you so much for this discussion. We encourage work group members to continue to comment on discourse, and we'll be working to synthesize the discussion and bring back helpful tools to frame our work together. So when you see this again, hopefully you'll see what you've just contributed reflected in the next iteration. This concludes agenda item 1. So public comment for this agenda item will close in 3 minutes. Please ensure any final public comments that you have now. We'll be closing that agenda item because we are now moving on to agenda item 2. Public comment for this item will open towards the end of the meeting. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to my colleague, Emily Esteban, who will introduce and facilitate our discussion on parent perspectives.
Thank you for the warm handoff, Maggie. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Esteban, and I am an associate with the Glenn Price Group. It is my pleasure to introduce the next 2 presentations. First, we will hear a presentation from the team at the Parent Institute for Quality Education, otherwise known as PK. After PK's presentation, we will move straight into a presentation from Child Trends. Both of these presentations will work to explore parent preferences and barriers families face in accessing high-quality pre-K programs, informing the following questions. And Caitlin, if you could advance to the slide with the question, that would be great. Perfect, thank you. The questions we'll be talking about today are: what are the barriers families face in accessing high quality universal preschool programs defined by statute as those meeting educational Title V standards for their 3 and 4-year-old children? And how can these barriers be addressed? After these presentations, we will have 30 minutes of work group discussion. First, let's hear from PK. I welcome Gloria Corral to introduce the presentation and her team.
Great. Thank you so much for your time here with us today. It's an honor to be here and share space with you as we do research and elevate the voices of families as the statewide initiative to advance universal mixed delivery system for pre-kindergarten for all children in California. I want to say that it was an honor to listen to these families and bring their voices to this discussion. And as we continue to learn and in this development process, to think about recommendations for this historic expansion of public education for children and family in the state. It's having exactly the voices, the perspectives, the aspirations of families at the center that will enable us to imagine a system that is equitable and able to meet the aspirations and the dreams of families for their children. A mixed delivery system that supports every child to achieve their potential and every family to engage and support lifelong learning. Let me now turn it over and introduce our Senior Program Associate, Nadia Hernandez, and our Vice President of Program and Impact, Sherry Blades, who both led the work and really are thrilled to be able to share their perspective with you today. Nadia?
Thank you, Gloria. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. UPK is a social justice and equity and education equity organization that impacts the lives of over 2 million children. For 35 years, UPK has partnered with schools and districts to work with families to bring our programming to them. This has earned us the trust of the various communities to listen and engage in an authentic dialogue with families. Our work is evidence-based and has allowed us the opportunity to authentically share the voices of families that has been critical to our work. Within this context, today you will hear about the hopes, the dreams, the experiences, and the values of families on quality pre-kindergarten education. Next slide. UPK conducted focus groups with 3 different communities we serve to learn about their experiences and understand the dreams that they have for their children's early education. These communities included the Spanish-speaking Latino community, the Mixtec Indigenous community, and the Black African American English-speaking community. 40 participants took part in the focus groups, which included parents, grandparents, and other primary caregivers. It was important for us to include the voices of these particular communities as they are the most vulnerable, underrepresented, underserved, and often marginalized communities. Next slide. At a closer look, these are the demographics of the 3 communities. The Latino focus group consisted of 15 participants residing in the Fresno, Bakersfield, and San Diego areas, and they come from a much lower economic bracket. The Mixtec focus group consisted of 10 participants, all living in a rural and agricultural community in Santa Maria, California. These participants identified as farm workers. The Black African American focus group consisted of 50 participants across California, including the Los Angeles, Orange County, and Northern California areas. Their household income for this group was much higher compared to the other groups. Additionally, they had higher levels of education. Next slide, please. UPK aimed to learn more about the perspectives these families have for their children during the preschool years as they are getting ready to enter into kindergarten. Next slide. Overall, these groups share their hopes for a better future for their children. In particular, the representatives from the Latino focus groups express their hopes to see their children attend college and have more opportunities than they had growing up. On the other hand, the mixed community aspired for their children to gain better economic employment. The participants expressed their full support for their children and whatever careers they decided to pursue. The participants from the Black African American community expressed their hopes for their children to be successful and grow up to be intelligent, happy, healthy, and wealthy children. Next slide, please. To share some of the perspectives of these families, a Latino participant shared their hope is for their children to gain more opportunities than they had growing up in their own country, with hopes that they graduate school and have better and more comfortable jobs that are not grueling or labor intensive. They express the importance of learning English to easily communicate in society. This is often a barrier that the Latino participants expressed as newly recent immigrants. Next slide, please. Another representative from the Mystic community also shared. Their hope is to see their children find better employment and not see them working in the fields. Through their education, they hope that their children are able to find secure and financially stable employment. Next slide, please. Similarly, a Black African American representative shared that they also dream of seeing their children complete a higher education, have more opportunities available to them, and find careers that match their interests. Next slide, please. More findings through this research revealed the desired components that these families value regarding the selection of early education programs. The responses highlighted several components that are important to them. These include finding programs in close proximity to them. They value safety and secure setting for their children, programs with a positive socio-emotional climate, having qualified teachers and credible programs. They shared that it was important for them to have trained staff to address any immediate medical needs. Lastly, they shared the importance of having adequate student to staff ratio, and this will be discussed later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. To highlight some of the family voices in regards to early education options, the first quote from a Black African American representative highlighted the desire for staff to be trained for a wide range of medical situations. A Latino participant shared how it was important for her to find a school close to her that felt safe for her daughter and where she would receive good treatment from her teachers. To continue with the rest of the findings is Sherry Blades.
Thank you so much, Nadia. So in order to talk about high quality education, it's important to hear what the term meant to families. All three groups spoke about safety in a variety of ways. Safety was defined as a safe setting with a positive learning climate, as well as having staff with more than the basic first aid training. Families who are in the Latino and Mixtec communities shared that language support was important in defining high quality. The Black African American participants further defined high quality as the staff not only holding appropriate credentials and certificates, but also possessing a high level of positive character traits. Next slide, please. An important component that was highlighted by Latino families was a welcoming and positive social emotional climate. They expressed a desire for their children's school to be a learning space where children have play-based learning options, feel happy and safe, gain confidence, and feel the respect and support of their teachers. One Latino parent spoke about the excitement their child would feel from a play-based learning environment. Another Latino parent commented that bullying was a concern for them. So being in a setting with a strong, positive social emotional climate was ideal for that family. Next slide, please. Participants discussed the qualities they would like to see their teachers have. In this graphic, the larger the text size, the more frequently the word was mentioned. Words like patient, mindful, fair, and warm highlight what is needed for a positive relationship building process, which families recognize is needed for their children to be most successful. Next slide, please. These quotes continue to highlight the teacher qualities that our participants desired: trust and respect, a motivating and safe learning climate, strong classroom management, and content knowledge. These topics were discussed by all three groups. Next slide, please. The Latino and Mixtec participants highlighted the importance of language support, not just for themselves, but also for their children. They shared how multilingual staff would increase family engagement and improve support for all. They talked about how this social emotional effects would impact their children, especially when they feel like language is a barrier to communicating. Next slide, please. A component that was highlighted by the Latino and Mixtec communities was having safe and developmentally appropriate facilities. They talked about wanting facilities that are safe, spacious, colorful, and accessible for our youngest learners. Physical layout of the facilities was discussed in great detail. Questions like, how close are the restrooms? Are they sized for their children? Where do the children eat snacks and lunches? How much space do the kids have to play and learn? These were all questions the participants think about. Next slide. The student to staff ratio was a major concern for our Mixtec participants. They discussed how enrollment impacts safety and support available for their children. They talked about if a teacher doesn't have extra eyes, ears, and hands available for children, it limits the ability to provide the attention and care their children need in a responsive time. Next slide. While the participants shared their aspirations for their children, perspectives, and experiences about early education, they also pointed out several challenges and concerns they face. They spoke about issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. Mixtec and Black African American participants expressed how racism and inequities impacted their access to certain schools, resources, and even prolonged enrollment processes. An equity barrier for the Mixtec community exists due to the rural setting. They talked about their limited choices for resources, schools, and programming. Next slide, please. Families in all three communities shared supports that they valued and desired prior to enrolling and while enrolled in school. These included supports they received to help children get into a program, support from their principal, community support prior to preschool, and efforts made to engage them as families in meaningful ways. These supports encourage them to understand how to enhance their child's learning at home prior to entering a formal school setting. Several Mixtec families discussed how valuable home visits or centralized local support was and could be for the early learning experiences for their children. There is a high desire for the earliest academic support to be offered in the Mixtec community due to lower levels of academic achievement from previous generations. Families expressed that they want to help their children with academics, like learning to write letters or numbers. However, the participants voiced that many of the adults in the community lacked the skills to implement this. A participant from the Black African American community expressed the need for schools and programs to have monitoring systems in place that valued the voices of families as part of that process. This participant talked about how when families have input, they could actually ensure confidence in the quality of the program and further the success of their children. They desire to be part of a hiring process or program improvement plan. They also wanted to be part of an evaluation process that monitors effectiveness of programs. Next slide, please. It is our hope that the voices of these families from 3 underserved, low-income, and often marginalized communities were elevated and heard. We are grateful to the families who shared their authentic comments, priorities, and perspectives, so that leaders in California who are creating this universal pre-K system can reflect on their hopes and concerns. If we can provide high-quality preschool experiences for all children in California, we will strengthen our state and support every child's ability to succeed and thrive. Next slide. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions about the research we conducted or any of the work we do to empower families and educators. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Sherry and Nadia. We really appreciate you both taking the time to be here today and to share your research. It's very enlightening.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Of course. I'm seeing some great conversation in the discourse from work group members as well in response to this presentation. So I want to remind folks, you can go ahead and use the heart or the like if you're agreeing with things that your colleagues are saying in the discourse. And you can also reply to indicate support and really just generate a conversation in that channel as well. Also, a new addition this meeting, our presenters are also in discourse. So if you have any clarifying questions regarding the materials, you can also elevate those in discourse as well. So that's an option for our work group members as they're conversing today. As indicated before, we are now going to move directly into the child trends presentation. Building on their February presentation, Child Trends will begin to unpack parent preferences on quality and barriers to accessing high-quality pre-K programs for 3- and 4-year-old children from the national research, specifically as it relates to their access framework. Joining us from Child Trends are Dr. Sarah Daly and Ashley Hiralal. Dr. Daly is a research scientist who focuses on early childhood research and the role that state policies and programs play in serving the needs of young children. Ashley Hiralal is an early childhood research scientist with extensive experience in quality-related elements of early education. With that, I am pleased to introduce our speakers and to welcome Dr. Daly and Ashley Hiralal to begin their presentation.
Thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. As Emily shared, my name is Ashley Hiralal. I'm a researcher at Child Trends. I'm just feeling so energized from the comments made in the open discussion, as well as the family findings just shared by the PK team. We're really happy to add to this conversation today with a way or strategy to continue to comprehensively identify and understand the needs, preferences, and barriers families face in accessing preschool. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So for our key objectives today, we're hoping to provide work group members with a potential strategy for assessing and supporting equitable access to the mixed delivery UPK program. And this strategy relies upon a definition of access that considers the needs and preferences of families. This approach can also help the work group identify where families may face inequities in accessing preschool and therefore increase their ability to have a genuine choice among preschool programs. On the next slide, I wanted to start by sharing how this field has traditionally thought about access. And so traditionally, the degree to which a family has access to a preschool program has been determined by comparing the demand for a preschool in a given community with the supply or the open number of slots available. However, we know that not all preschool slots are equally accessible or meet families' needs or meet the specific needs of all families. In fact, simply comparing supply and demand can actually overestimate the preschool options that are truly available to families. And so for this reason, a more equitable understanding of access is really needed that considers both the lived experiences of and the barriers families may experience in accessing care that meets their family's needs and preferences. On the next slide, we just wanted to build a foundation of our presentation by defining equitable access. And so to us, equitable access means that children and families, regardless of multiple dimensions and intersecting identities, such as their race, ethnicity, gender, language, ability, immigration status, where they're located in your state, the religion that they practice, their income, among many other characteristics of identity, do not disrupt who has access to all preschool options and are able to select their preferred preschool programs. So to address the gaps and inconsistencies in understanding access, Child Trends, in partnership with the Office of Research, Planning, and Evaluation, created a new multi-dimensional conceptualization of access that takes into account the unique needs and preferences of families. And so in the next set of slides, I'll describe the 4 dimensions of this new way of examining access. However, it's important to note that these dimensions are interrelated and that families of different backgrounds may experience multiple challenges that span across these dimensions. So the first access dimension we'll talk about is accessibility of information and location. So this dimension considers the level of effort that is required for a family to find or obtain information about a preschool program, the level of effort that's required for them to enroll or prove eligibility. And so, for example, how might the level of effort differ for families whose primary language is English compared to families whose primary language is Spanish or Cantonese or Somali? This dimension also considers the level of effort that is required for families to access the physical location of the program itself. And so we can think about the distance that from a family's home or work, the drive times they need to complete, the time spent on public transportation. And a key question we want to consider here is, do some families face bigger barriers in their effort to transport their child to and from the preschool programs than others? The second dimension we'll talk about today is cost, and this dimension, of course, refers to the financial costs associated with attending a program. And so it includes considering the extent to which costs such as tuition and fees vary for families and can potentially create inequities in access. Costs in the context of the mixed delivery UPK context might include things like the cost of public transportation, that a family may need in order to access a given preschool program. It can include things like the cost of the meals or snacks if a family needs to provide them, or the costs for special programming such as field trips or other events. In the third dimension, we consider whether or not the preschool program meets the parents' needs. And so a family's ability to access a preschool program will also depend upon the extent to which the program is provided in the parent's preferred care setting. And so, for example, a family may need a preschool program that is located in a setting that it can accommodate the care and education of an older or perhaps younger sibling in their family. Or a family may need full-time programming, or perhaps they need a provider that can provide before or after school care. Caregivers who speak family's home language might be one of their preferences, or a program that provides transportation and meals might be an important consideration for the family. Last but definitely not least is the dimension about meeting the child's needs. And so this dimension considers a family's ability to access preschool programs that support the developmental and cultural needs of the child. And so this includes the ability of a program to promote the child's language and literacy development, their cognitive skills, social and emotional development, as well as their physical development. You might also consider the ways in which the program creates inclusive learning environments that are responsive to the children's unique needs, and the ways in which the program can create culturally affirming and responsive learning environments. For example, a family may prefer that a child receive care in their home language, or that a program offers specialized supports for their child with a disability. And now we can go to the next slide. So this multi-dimensional definition of access can be paired with a definition of equity to examine the extent to which children and families have equitable access and choice among preschool programs. I'm going to share some images on the next few slides so we can get a better idea of the difference between equity and equality. And I'm sure some of these images are familiar to you all. Starting in this first panel, you can see that supports are available, but they're one size fits all, which definitely does not fit all. In the equity panel, people are given the appropriate support so that they can see over the fence. However, you'll see that there's still a fence, there's still a barrier in place. And so we can think of justice as being achieved when barriers are removed and everyone can see the game, as shown in the third panel. There have also been many variations of this image to focus on different parts of the message. And so, for example, in this image, we can see that the supports aren't necessarily accessible to everyone in the equality panel, and that different kinds of supports may be necessary for everyone to achieve their goals, as shown in the equity panel. At Child Trends, we thought we could add some images of our own. The image on the left depicts equality. Everyone has the same supports to reach the same goals. However, everyone's goals for their families and how they want their child to grow may be different. So on the right, you can see that there are different kinds of supports provided, and each person is receiving the tailored outcome or choice of what they're reaching for. So I'd like to walk through an illustration of applying the dimensions of access and potential inequities. So consider the following example as a way to both identify the dimensions of the access framework and pair it with equity principles to help us really hone in on the needs, preferences, and potential barriers that one hypothetical family might face in accessing a preschool program. So in this example, imagine two parents who work from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. They predominantly speak Hmong and have a preschool-aged child with a disability, and would prefer a preschool program in a school-based setting so they have one drop-off and pick-up for their preschooler and their older child. So the following slide maps these needs, preferences, and potential barriers to the 4 dimensions of access. Go to the next slide, please. So when reflecting on this example, consider that equitable access is achieved when characteristics of a child or family's identity, such as their race, ethnicity, language, ability, immigration status, and other dimensions of identity, do not predict their ability to access a preschool program. And in addition, equitable access is not achieved if parents have to choose which among their needs and preferences are most critical while sacrificing other preferences due to limited or inadequate choices. So with that, looking at the first dimension, information and accessibility, this family that I described in the scenario may face inequitable barriers in accessing information about available preschool programs, especially if this information is only provided in English. In this example, cost of the preschool program may not be a primary barrier. However, the cost of the before and after school care will be a key consideration that will determine which preschool programs are truly accessible or usable by the family. In meets parents' needs, this family will need to find a preschool program that offers care or supervision options before and after the operating hours of the preschool program. That they need to find care that is based in a school setting and perhaps care that can communicate with the family in their home language among. To meet the child's need, the preschool programs need to have staff that have the skills and competencies to support the development of their child with a disability. And perhaps they'll need to have staff that can support the child's dual language skills. As demonstrated in the previous examples, parents are weighing many factors when making decisions about early learning experiences. Included in these decisions are considerations about the quality of teaching practices and curriculum that their child will receive from the caregiver, as well as the quality of the physical setting. Research on parent preferences for quality shows alignment with some key structural programming components and processes, such as the use of developmentally appropriate practices, curriculum, and other materials, as well as making sure that they're tracking their child's development over time. In addition, we know that parents value practices that promote their child's social and emotional development, such as warm, caring, and responsive caregiving. And so while national research on quality aggregates parents' preferences, the dimensions of access can help the work group identify the specific needs and preferences of parents in a more local context. And so understanding the nuanced needs and preferences of various families at a local context will actually, we see, be as a more helpful way to assess and support equitable access to the mixed delivery UPK program. Wanted to summarize with some key takeaways from our presentation. And that is just having a clearly defined definition of access can really help the work group do these 4 following things. First, it can help you all develop a more specific and multidimensional understanding of families' needs and preferences for a preschool program. Secondly, it can help you all determine where there might be inequitable barriers to access based on the 4 dimensions that we covered. So accessibility of information or location, the cost, the ability of a preschool to meet parents' needs and child's needs. Thirdly, once the identified barriers can help you then right size solutions that are needed in order to increase access equitably. And lastly, this definition of access can help inform and make sense of data collection and any other information gathering efforts with families through surveys, focus groups, or even parent leadership teams can reflect on these 4 dimensions and identify where access is working and not working for their family and within their community. I want to end with a final note in that increasing access to preschool programs does not need to just be about building new or expanding existing programs. Increasing equitable access to preschool will include designing information and outreach efforts that are accessible to all families, examining the collective cost to families for their child to attend a preschool program, and examining the structure and capacity of preschool programs to meet the unique and intersecting needs of parents and children.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for the wonderful presentation. We appreciate you spending the time with us today and elevating your access framework. I will now facilitate our work group member discussion to start unpacking what they have elevated. Again, the guiding question that we will be framing our discussion around today is, what are the barriers families face in accessing high quality universal preschool programs, defined by statute as those meeting educational Title V standards for their 3 and 4-year-old children? And how can these barriers be addressed? Workgroup members, if you would like to participate by making verbal comments, please use the raise hand function. You can also utilize Discord for written comments, which I see there are many, which is really great. And with that, I will welcome whoever wants to start our discussion today.
I won. My hand is up.
Sorry, who was that?
Otokonda.
Oh, thank you, Otokonda. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the barrier that the parents has, I'm a childcare provider. It's they have the language barrier, the immigration status, and not being knowledgeable in education, and short funding from the state to help to pay for the programs that the child or the parent want to enroll the child. And also they include social and stress and the socio-economic that the parents face in a new land, a new country. And for that to be remediated, the government have to invest in primary childcare home, to have more space, material, supplies, pay for extra teacher, and to help them, to help us like have our home ready and a big, if we had to expand one more room or something to have access for more children. And the outcome that if the government do that, we're gonna identify the kids and also the language for the kid, between the kids, and we wanna keep the home language. The home language, if we keep it, we have to have also teacher or people that can help transition for like immigrant children. When they come, they have another language. They have the way of doing things, and you cannot just enter and break it and make them learn English the same day and such a thing. So we need extra teacher to help us while we are coping with people, kids that already know that are born here. We can also have a group of kids that are not born here, that are immigrant, and help them transition by having more attention, pay attention to what they need, pay attention to the emotion, need and the cognitive development, and they communicate that to the state, because in there, we're gonna have special ed, we're gonna have kids with disability that the parent didn't even know. So by that too, to help family home childcare to send, or to help family home childcare to assess, to notice, because at school they have all those how do you call it, all those equipment or material or people. They have psychologists, they have doctors, they have everybody that know exactly that their child have a development need. But in the community, we don't have that. So we just helping the kid to go through and helping pushing them to the school system. We don't know what they have. So when they go to the school system, when they enter, that's when they're gonna find out that this kid have a language delayed, they have a HADD or whatever. So then it's gonna have time for them to help them, to cater them. But if they know it from the community, from the childcare provider, if they can come even once every quarter to assess, which they diagnose those kids that are 3 years old and 4 years old before they go to kindergarten or pre-kindergarten, we will have a much better way to welcome them to school and to put them where they belong and how to help them and to find people to help them for the long run.
Great, thank you for that comment, Otokonda. I hear a lot of, you've identified a lot of barriers regarding language match, regarding immigration status, identification of disabilities. And I welcome further conversation. I see, Christian, you have your hand up. I welcome you to take the floor.
Hi. So one of the things that I keep kind of ruminating on, and I think both of these presentations really did a good job of highlighting, is that although there are multiple care options within one community, county, each type of care comes with its own pros, areas for improvement, qualifications, and every option within a county, only some of them will be the right fit for the families looking to access them. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that as organizations seeking to support families within our communities, one of the things that we're really going to have to focus on, not only locally, but as a state, is really parent education about what the options are, what types of qualifications, system ideologies come with each type, so that families actually are aware of where they can send their 3 and 4-year-olds.
That's great, Christian. Hear you echoing the barrier on parents even knowing where these options are, what those options are, and continuing identification of those barriers. I welcome Hannah to take the next comment.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. The communication piece, I think, is so critical, and it's actually somewhere where we as a working group might be able to provide some useful input and how parents can make sense of the choices that are available to them. As a parent of a 4-year-old, it's exhausting trying to figure out where to send your child to preschool. And I have, all the resources and knowledge that I can put in the time and the flexibility to go look, but most families do not have that. And I found it very difficult. And it just, there are a lot of benefits of community programs over LEAs, but at least when your child is going to kindergarten, there's usually one place where you need to go to find out how to get your child into school. And if we can make it easier for families through communications and through understanding what the options are, I think then people will be making much more informed choices about how to weigh the options that they have.
Great. Thanks, Hannah, for building off Christian's comment on communication and ensuring that all people are getting that information. I'm going to move to Scott and then Encina in supporting voices that haven't spoke yet, and then we'll move on to others. Go ahead, Scott.
Yes, thank you. I'll keep mine brief. I want to concur with the other comments and also just stress that it's a very important time that we could also better consider the needs of our students and families of students with disabilities. I would echo the previous comment and also say that for our families that are thinking about high quality care for their preschoolers with disabilities, that decision is even heavier upon that family to ensure that the staff is welcoming and also has the expertise required to meet the needs of their students. So I would hope as we continue to look through that equity lens that we might be able to further flesh out some of the challenges and barriers that have been prevalent for our students with disabilities across California.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Speaking a little bit to that intersectionality and multiple experiences students and families may have. Go ahead, Encina, you can take the next comment.
And I too want to echo on some of the comments that were made previously. And speaking back to some of the things Christian was talking about in ensuring that parents are aware of not only quality factors, but also how to locate these different caregiving contexts. And I want to just kind of piggyback on the development of the quality rating improvement system and how initially that system was primarily designed to educate families on what type of quality indicators they should be looking for when they select or when they're looking for a specific caregiving context to service their child. And so I'm wondering in ways of how that system that we already have created and invested millions of dollars into, how we can utilize that as a framework to build on and build upon and figure out a different way of how that information could be disseminated to families within the communities.
Great. Thank you for that comment, Encina. Thinking through how we can build from existing resources and materials that have been developed to support these families in another way. Next, we can go to Dr. Lawanda and then Patricia.
Hi, all. I'm participating on my phone because I have tech issues. I want to build on that comment that was shared just from the last work group member and the one before that. Having been a QRS navigator for Alameda County, there were some really good things in there about consumer education, although we know QRS still needs, some improvement. But I was thinking about a crosswalk. So you have like Title V comes with its quality standards and markers, and that was put into statute some time ago. And then we have this post sort of summer 2020, where we start to think about the lived experiences and the lived expertise of those most impacted by these programs. In this case, it's families. What if we were to think about something really concrete by looking at a crosswalk between Title V, QRS, and then quality markers as deemed by parents, and look across where we're similar and where they're different. And I think that would be a great exercise. Again, a Title V, a QRS, and then a lot of what the research that was presented today, look at the quality markers that are coming from specific groups, the Black and Brown community, and so on. And I think that would be a fruitful exercise to see where we're aligned and where we're nuanced.
That's a great flag, thinking through moving forward how we can put these different resources that we have in conversation with each other to inform the recommendations from this work group. Take it away, Patricia.
Hi, good afternoon. Just wanted to bring up one barrier that many families face, and it's the language barriers that, if the family doesn't speak English at home, many times it's really hard to get information about programs. And at the same time, so it's the families having access to the information in multiple languages, but also giving the resources to providers and teachers to be able to connect with the families. So I think that's a barrier that we should think about, and also supports both the families and those who are working the programs to be able to connect and provide the information they need.
Great, thank you for elevating the need to include language in this discussion as well. Next, we'll go to May, and then we'll go to Samantha. So go ahead, May.
Hi. So thank you for the previous comment about on this very important topic. Within the program, we also see that there are a lot of parents who are really confused and also feel like it's a lot of question about the enrollment process. Especially right now, the state is working on really, because of the separation of CDSS and CDE, and there are many new regulations that's coming up and also adjustment. And so in the meantime, because of the blending and layering of funding, so the eligibility trying to jive with, for example, Head Start, early Head Start eligibility component, it's quite a very gigantic task, even for the program ourselves, to figure out what is what and how to go about streamline the process of enrollment for families. And and we all understand that the state is trying very hard to make things easier for the field, and it has been working better now because recently the eligibility is able to align to a certain degree. For example, the newly introduced categorical eligibility. So those are very helpful. And so if we can continue to work toward that direction and just try to streamline the eligibility and enrollment for families and even for programs too, that would be very important. And one thought on that is that whether we should look at maybe consider a centralized enrollment system for the state so that this system basically can explain to all parents clearly and universally about what is the best fit for your family situation, or what would be the best program option for your children. So that may be something to consider. And one more thing about parent hope for quality program is in the program we often hear about parents' concern and expectation about pre-academic skill, even though they do want their children to be happy and play and make friends and everything. However, they also have the expectation that, oh, my child is 4 years old or my child is 3 years old. They should be able to hold a pencil and write the alphabet and say their ABCs, count their 1, 2, 3s, and they do have expectation pre-academic skills for their children. And so when they see play-based curriculum, we have to really be that partners to provide parents the information that play-based, why play-based, or project approach, that may be a better options for child-centered curriculum and that kind of thing. So that's also very prevalent in the program, that parent has that high expectation as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for those comments, May. I hear you bringing up again that theme of communicating with parents, but also bringing in the parent expectation of certain academic benchmarks, thinking through what play-based learning means to audiences that may not know what that means. All really great points. Thank you for bringing them up. I will pass it now off to Samantha.
Thank you. I would like to echo the suggestion by Dr. Lawanda regarding the kind of crosswalk consideration. And I think that integrates the prior participants' suggestions as well, in terms of including those indicators that are prioritized by families. But I do want to also reference and just having been a former centralized eligibility list administrator as well as a QRIS administrator, and while the state does a very good job of establishing and developing communication resources to use with families, we still have to take into consideration that there are families that are not connected or have these relationships with programs already to be able to be informed of those resources. So really want to uplift the consideration of how do we access families? Where are families receiving their information? Taking into consideration cultural brokers. Most individuals learn about childcare and preschool options through their family and friends. So how do we really begin to cultivate a better understanding about how to access resources and what available resources are out there for families? And I really would encourage us to think about in terms of like this whole child approach, and really begin to think about this whole community approach. Because again, if we're wanting to change outcomes for children, we really need to begin to think about the ecosystem that supports those children. And I think this is a critical component for that.
Thank you for that comment, Samantha. And I think you did a really great job of framing not just how are parents accessing us, but how are we accessing parents? I'm kind of flipping that on its head and asking ourselves how we can begin to address these barriers in a way that makes the most sense for those families and parents. We do still have quite a bit of time left to discuss, so I welcome any folks who have already spoken. I know, Jennifer, you had your hand raised earlier. Oh, there she is. All right, go ahead, Jennifer, take it away.
One thing that we're kind of talking about in the different chat thing too is just the financial accessibility and equitability for families. I know we've talked about other different barriers, and so that's one on both respective ends, and it kind of goes with the equitable and equal and different things like that. And even looking at families that make too much, they get stuck in the kind of the conundrum too for the preschool that they don't qualify for a CSPP. There's waiting lists in the the private sector, and so they're left without an option. And so many times that is kind of the option of, well, what's left for us? Are we left to go out and kind of find different things? So just kind of looking at, as we're looking at trying to expand and look at all of that, that financial barrier too, on both ends of the spectrum, making sure we're giving kids access to quality education.
Great. Thank you for looping in a conversation that's happening on Discourse to our verbal channel. I will welcome Gloria, since you haven't spoken on this yet, and then we will go over to Christian again.
Well, I think one of the things that we again need to really re-examine, just picking up on the universality component, is transportation. You heard it time and again, especially in our rural communities. I don't want to say exclusively in our rural communities because it's not exclusive to. I think the presentation that Child Trend raised for us was how much time our families spending on public transportation, right? I think transportation is something that cannot be overstated, in the sense that it really asks us to think holistically about, as we started off this conversation, the child within the context of a family, which is in the context of a community, of a city, right? Because I think one of the things that we have figured out as a K-12 education system is actually, now flawed as it might be, talking about access through the lens of where is it and how is it that children show up to school. Now, can it be improved? Certainly, and there are, I'm not recommending we replicate what is being done. I do think it's important for us to think, though, that transportation really is no amount of information will overcome that barrier, right? I mean, again, as you heard from the voices of the families we spoke to, that Sherry and Nadia lifted up, transportation was the reason why there was even a consideration about whether or not options were even considered. If there was no transportation, by definition, there will be no access. And so I do think that as valuable as, as Samantha was pointing out, 15 years in early childhood and, and all the preceding work is really important to inform where we are today. I think thinking holistically about what it means for families to have access. Once we can't assume that if we haven't talked about what are those physical barriers, specifically transportation and capacity, that need to be addressed in order for there to be conversation about quality. I think they're in tandem. I don't think we divide them up. I do think, though, that this is, as Nancy and others who are part of the kind of the broader education system institutions, it has been figured out, right? That this is something that our K-12 system has figured out, that we need to really explore, because that barrier cannot be overcome. The access barrier to transportation cannot be overcome with conversations about information quality. If families can't have access because it is not near anywhere where they can get to, it really is a moot point for those families. Again, which children are we centering, right? For those families, it is a go, no go if we don't talk about transportation and access from that vantage point.
Great point, Gloria. Thank you for grounding us additionally in kind of the physical implications, how you even get to a site, even if you know it exists. So thank you for bringing that up to this discussion. We'll go to Christian and then we'll pass it over to Nancy.
So I started to think about kind of the bigger system and how many nuances there are between Title 22, Title 5, Title 1, all of the grant funding, CSPP, CCTR, Head Start, all of the others. And so as kind of UPK continues rolling out, it's going to be very important that we find a way to either create resources or supports to allow educators, families, communities to kind of understand what those components mean, what the differences between them are, and kind of, as you pointed out, programs need to be able to reach out to families. It's not just families reaching out to programs. And so I think it's just going to be a really important time to develop some of that language and understanding between all of those various licensing components and funding components that kind of blend, braid, and layer to create all the options for families.
Great, thank you, Christian. We'll go over to Nancy.
Am I unmuted? Okay. You know, as I'm hearing and agreeing with all of the complexity for families and navigating access to Head Start, state preschool versus TK, all of the different eligibility criteria involved, I'm also reflecting on the challenges for families and even programs to access services for students with disabilities. And what I'm reflecting on is, as we were starting up the Help Me Grow initiative here in Sacramento County, I was surprised as we were going out and meeting with medical providers. These are doctors, professionals who work with young children on a daily basis that weren't even aware of where to refer children if they were 3 to 4, that this is a school district for children with disabilities to be assessed, and that there's another entity or the regional centers and county offices to serve the 0 to 3. There was no knowledge in many cases, and that what that tells me is navigating access to special education service is yet another complex factor in this whole maze. And I don't know personally how knowledgeable all of our family child care providers, our private early learning center providers, even state preschool programs that may not be operated by school districts. So it's a question for me. It's an assumption that there are many challenges in navigating access to assessments and services for children with disabilities in these early years. And it's such a critical window in terms of accessing services in that 0 to 5 age range. So I want to elevate that challenge in this discussion.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for kind of pulling back. I believe it was Scott's comment about that additional factor when you do have a child with disabilities and navigating that additional system on top of it. I will welcome Melissa to make a comment.
Hi, everyone. So obviously I can't speak on everyone's own individual experience when it comes to barriers, but I feel like I can speak on my own community and some of those barriers that we encounter. And I know language is a very big part of that. So we like to include inclusive language because we have to be also very sensitive to certain cultures that don't maybe like labels and don't like their children to be initially labeled as something when that could maybe deter them from actually enrolling in a program because they're worried their children might be labeled as something versus, just having those resources available and kind of guiding them to those resources. So for example, I know a big barrier is potty training. And some 3 and 4-year-olds might not be potty trained. And parents or families could be, turned off by that and where they need to be potty trained. And so again, I'm leaving this up to every individual educator to come up with a solution on their own communities. But within ours, we definitely try to include some sort of inclusive language that doesn't necessarily label them as something, but more so try to provide that support in order for them to kind of be welcomed into a high quality preschool program and not necessarily have them immediately labeled as something because they have not met a certain milestone. So I know some cultures are more sensitive to certain things than other cultures, and we should definitely keep that in mind, especially when we serve specific communities. So just kind of remembering that inclusive language does matter and how we approach that when we start talking to families about, like, let's say, tender topics and things like that.
Great, thank you for elevating that, Melissa. And with that, we're just about 2:30, so we're going to consider that our last comment. Thank you to all the work group members who made verbal comments today, who added to our discourse discussion. If you have any additional comments, thoughts about this topic, you can always use discourse to continue the conversation or email the UPK inbox as well. Keep in mind when you are writing comments, submitting written comment, it should only address what's covered in the agenda. Now we're going to move into a brief break and then we will reconvene at around 2:45. Thank you all.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back from break. Just a few quick notes before we get started in our next session. For workgroup members using Discord, please feel free to use the heart icon to indicate agreement with ideas from your fellow workgroup members. Also, when we get to the discussion, we hope to hear from as many voices as possible. So we'll try to prioritize hearing from members who have not yet had an opportunity to contribute today. And we also encourage you to try to keep your remarks to about 2 minutes so that we can hear from as many voices as possible. So let's go ahead and get started in our next session. My name is Caitlin Vaccarezza, and I'm Vice President at GPG. And I have the pleasure of introducing a group of presenters who will provide an overview of current quality standards across settings and practices. The goal of this presentation is to build a shared understanding of standards across various settings and how implementation of these standards vary in practice. The question on this slide is a general concept for what we should be listening for during the presentation. What is the current status of quality, both standards and practice, within California's mixed delivery model? With that framing, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers. First, we have Hannah Melnick from the Learning Policy Institute. Hannah, in addition to being a member of this work group, has extensive research experience as a senior policy advisor and co-leader of LPI's Early Childhood Learning team. Joining Hannah, we have Nina Boothie, Executive Director of Every Child California, an association of leaders advancing early learning that advocates for programs across the state by supporting the development of the child's social, emotional, and intellectual well-being, all while in a safe and high-quality learning environment. To inform the work group on how standards are different in Head Start settings, we will be joined by Judy Reed Parker from Start Early. Start Early, formerly the Ounce of Prevention, is a nonprofit public-private partnership that works directly with children and families, supports and trains the early childhood workforce, and partners at the local, state, and federal levels to ensure policies put families first. They have deep expertise in a number of areas that the work group will be exploring. Finally, we will also have a brief presentation from Virginia Early at the California Department of Education, who will talk about the Family Child Care Home Education Network model. This portion of the presentation was created in tandem with our partners at CDSS. With that, I will hand it over to Hannah to kick us off.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. I think you may end up needing to advance my, oh, there it goes. Thank you. So I'm really glad to be here today. And so we are going to be speaking about quality standards governing California's preschool program. And we're going to be looking at, can you go back to the prior slide, please? Thanks. Prior. And one back. Thank you. So I'm joined by Nina and Judy today to talk about the quality standards governing California's preschool program. And we're going to be looking at the standards that were introduced in the January working group in the following categories: diversity, equity, inclusion, and family and community engagement, the learning environment, and staffing. I'm going to be giving a brief overview of the standards, and then Judy will dive deeper on Head Start, and Nina is going to talk about some of the kind of the implementation challenges and issues that come up in practice in programs. And I think a lot of this is starting to touch on what we're beginning to talk about in discourse about needing a crosswalk of how to make sense of the programs as a whole. And then Virginia will talk about special considerations for family child care home education networks. Next slide. Thank you. So California has several different programs that serve preschool age children that are governed by different quality standards that can be somewhat confusing. These include licensed centers and family child care homes that must meet the Title 22 health and safety regulations, the California State Preschool Program that needs to meet Title V education standards, in addition to Title 22. And these standards are designed to support child development and instructional programming. Head Start needs to meet the Head Start performance standards that are set at the federal level. And these standards are like Title V, but in many instances are more prescriptive. And we'll hear more about that later today. And then transitional kindergarten, which in addition to meeting standards, the same standards as K-12 programs, also need to meet the standards that are laid out in Education Code 4800. So today we're going to be highlighting places where the standards are in alignment with each other and where they're not. And we hope that you'll be thinking about where there's room to move towards more consistent and equitable standards that are in line with the Master Plan for Early Learning and Care, and also with what families want for their children. Next slide. So we're going to be digging in mostly to the education standards, but we also want to take a closer look at some of the what the health and safety standards Title 22 are before we move on. Licensing standards are the foundation from which quality is built because they ensure that programs need to maintain children's health and safety, which is obviously first and foremost in families' minds. For example, these standards require that programs be able to support children who are ill with children's key medical information on hand, performing CPR and first aid and so on. But they also extend to the physical environment in terms of the amount of space and the kind of equipment and how that is made accessible for students with disabilities. Personnel requirements that set minimum standards for staff in terms of safety and training and background checks, as well as ratios for adequate supervision of children. and parent and child rights. For example, how children may not be disciplined and the kinds of information that needs to be shared with and received from families. Title 22 applies to all licensed child care and preschool programs, but some programs are notably exempt. For example, TK and some state preschool serving 4-year-olds on LEA campuses are exempt because they meet other standards, and some parks and recreation programs and so on are also exempt. Next slide. So we're going to look next at some of the family and community engagement standards that govern programs, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion standards within Title V TK, the standards for TK and for Head Start. Next. So I'm first just going to explain what the standards are, and then again, Judy and Nina are going to follow up on kind of what it looks like in practice. When it comes to family and community engagement, programs really vary in how prescriptive they are, with Head Start having the most detailed requirements. PK to 12 schools need to have a school site council in which families can become involved, and schools that have a certain number of English learners need to have an English learner advisory committee. The LEA needs to explain its engagement plan and its local control accountability plan, or LCAP, which itself also has rules for community and family engagement and how that plan is formed. CSCP gets a little bit more prescriptive. So it's required to have a family engagement and strengthening component that includes parent meetings, an advisory committee, survey, and service referrals, and a community involvement component that includes facilitating connections between families, LEAs, and social services. And I'm going to pass it to Judy to speak a little bit about the Head Start requirements.
So as you see on the slide, Head Start's requirements for family and community engagement range from classroom activities, individual family partnership plans, so on. Head Start family and community engagement are guided by the Parent, Family, and Community Engagement Framework, and there are established relationship-based competencies for family and community engagement. Respecting parents as a child's first teacher, strategies for father engagement, and ensuring family engagement activities are provided in the family's preferred language are also required. Head Start programs are also expected to engage with community partners to help facilitate comprehensive child services. And now I'll pass this off to Nina.
Thank you, Judy. As outlined on the slide, CSPP programs and Title V state preschool programs must include a robust family engagement component. This includes a program orientation, a parent advisory committee, and an open door policy for parents to participate as they can. Family and community engagement are a critical component in providing a high quality program for children and their families. And although Title V state preschool programs have this as a foundational requirement, they often struggle with having the time and a dedicated staff person to do this effectively. As referenced on some of the previous panels, teachers are often overburdened with having to do it alone, left to figuring it out with the multiple expectations and daily requirements that they have to fulfill. Teachers really do need dedicated time to prepare and reflect, and the security and confidence of having a team to share in this responsibility.
We'll move to the next slide. All right, so for multilingual learners, programs also have quality standards, although for the most part, these are a little bit less highly specific. For TK, LEAs need to assess and report English learner status and report on services that it's providing to English learners in its LCAP, although those services are for TK to 12 students generally. Title V specifies that state preschool CSPP must meet the cultural and linguistic needs of families, including support in children's home language, and that staff shall reflect the linguistic makeup of providers, of children and of families. So that doesn't specify how exactly what that means and how they will be held accountable. And then Head Start again gets more specific, as Judy will explain.
So in the Head Start classroom, if the majority of children in the classroom speak the same language, at least one class staff member must speak also that same language. Screenings and assessments must be conducted in the child's home language. And for preschoolers, the focus is on supporting English language acquisition while also supporting the continuing development of the home language. Nina?
For Title V programs, many efforts have been made to enhance best practice approaches in meeting children and their families' unique needs. This is accomplished by treating all children and their families with respect and by embracing their ethnic background, culture, language, socioeconomic status, and/or disability. The California State Preschool Program, CSPP, identifies dual language learners when they enroll and serve them, and it requires the providers through contract requirements to report key information about dual language learners that inform future policy and program decisions. State preschool programs aim to hire teaching staff who reflect the diversity of children and families served. However, oftentimes this is not possible. Additionally, EdCode outlines that program activities and services must meet the cultural and linguistic needs of children and families, included but not limited to program activities and services that meet the need of dual language learners for support in the development of their home language as well as English.
Next, we're going to speak about inclusion. Thank you. So all programs are required by federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, to provide services to children with an identified disability and the least restrictive environment. So this is kind of a point where some of the same standards do govern all the programs. Although the extent to which they're able to or do meet these requirements varies, as I'm sure we'll be talking about. To ensure that children with disabilities are being served, Head Start and CSPP both must serve a minimum of 10% of children with disabilities, of the children who are enrolled in the program. For state preschool, right now, the percentage that's required is 5%, and that is going to increase over the next few years to 7.5% and then to 10% by 2024-25. Many LEAs also offer classes specifically for preschoolers with disabilities, and they have often the resources such as speech and language pathologists on site that meet those requirements. And Judy will speak to the Head Start.
So programs must support parents as they navigate the early intervention system, working closely with the local agency responsible for implementing IDEA, typically the local education agency, and other service providers to ensure the individual needs of children eligible for IDEA services are met. This includes developing interagency agreements, providing information for screenings, assessments, and observations to the team developing the child's IEP, and participating in IEP meetings. If the LEA as a service provider can't meet the child's needs, the Head Start provider is required to support and ensure learning experiences are provided in the least restrictive environment possible. Nina?
High quality inclusion supports children's development, both for children with and without disabilities. The funding for CSPP programs is restricted to support inclusive learning opportunities for children with disabilities while meeting the least restrictive environment requirements. In order to qualify for this, children with disabilities need to have either an IEP or IFSP in place. The individualized education plans or individualized family support plans can be difficult to navigate for children outside of local education agencies. Children can be referred for an IEP, and then the school district must assess and must provide services if they are found to meet the requirements for the IEP.
Next, we're going to talk about the standards that govern the learning environment. And we'll start with early learning standards and curriculum. The Preschool Learning Foundations is a point of alignment across programs. We'll just pause for a moment as the slides get back. Actually, I'll continue, and maybe Caitlin, if you were able to get back to the standards and curriculum side. So the Preschool Learning Foundations is a point of alignment across programs. It's used in both CSPP and in TK. The specific language about what's required, TK must use a modified kindergarten curriculum that is aged and developmentally appropriate and aligned to the Preschool Learning Foundation. CSPP must have an educational program that's guided by the Preschool Learning Foundation. It doesn't technically need to have a curriculum, although there are certain aspects of the educational program that are laid out in regulations. And then Head Start is a little bit more prescriptive again, so pass it to Judy.
So Head Start requires a developmentally appropriate research-based curriculum implemented with fidelity. Programs are required to provide teachers time for planning and training on implementing that curriculum. And the Head Start framework is compatible with the Preschool Learning Foundations, and California grantees assure that their curriculum is aligned with both. The majority of Head Start grantees in California use the creative curriculum.
For Title V state preschool programs, they have standards for their educational program as well as their environment. The program approach addresses equity, diversity, and is required to be developmentally, linguistically, and culturally appropriate. State preschool programs are required to have an educational program. In practice, this sometimes means curriculum is selected at the local level. There is no statewide prescribed curriculum. And other times it means that programs adopt an approach, but no standard curriculum is in place. All teaching practices are designed for young children, supporting their social and emotional development, cognitive and language skills, ability for creative self-expression, interaction amongst peers and adults, and more. Although Title V state preschool programs have the Preschool Learning Foundations, they lack designated state-paid professional development time to access resources to best understand how to utilize them for group and individualized support, not to mention the absence of dedicated paid prep time to effectively promote intentional practice.
So for assessment, TK assessments are determined by the LEA. We're speaking specifically about child assessments that are ongoing rather than screeners. Whereas the state preschool program requires the use of one specific assessment, the desired result developmental profile, or DRDP. And regulation states that the DRDP needs to be administered every 6 months and that the data needs to be used to inform the educational program. And Judy?
And by child assessments, we mean an ongoing way of understanding children's learning. Screening is like a snapshot of a child's health and development, while assessment is like a documentary film, an ongoing story of a child's health and development that is then used to inform individualized instruction. Head Start requires ongoing observations and a formal assessment to be conducted at least 3 times a year. The assessment must include family input, with the results of the formal assessment shared with the family during parent-teacher conferences. Additionally, the cumulative assessment results for the program are shared with the Policy Council and should be used to inform the professional development of classroom staff. Nina?
The CSPP education program requirement from Title V requires the use of data from the desired results developmental profile, which is the child assessment tool used in Title V. This is to support every child's developmentally appropriate participation in the program. These are done a minimum of twice annually and inform the instruction for the children. And although not required, they are totally full of incredible information and should be transferred to either transitional kindergarten or kindergarten teachers. This regular ongoing observation, in addition, the use of data from the environmental rating scales and information gained from the parent survey is required to inform and help guide individualized support to children. As part of teacher credentialing, most programs include coursework on formative and summative assessments.
So for adult to child ratios, there is obviously very large variation across programs, as you'll see in the chart, and there are several factors that play into ratios, including the ages of the children, whether children are napping, and the qualifications of the adults. But in general, licensed homes allow no more than 6 preschoolers at a time. There can be more if they're school-aged children included. Licensed centers allow no more than 12 children over the age of 2 per adult. CSCP allows no more than 8. Head Start allows no more than 10. Although if children are under the age of 3, it's again a maximum of 8. And then in TK, there's currently a maximum of 12 children per adult. And the legislature has signaled the intent to reduce ratios to 1 to 10 contingent upon funding. Class sizes are similarly varied. Licensed homes, the absolute maximum is 14 children in a group, but that group size is smaller in a small family childcare home or when school-age children are not present. Licensed centers and CSTP don't have a maximum class size. The number of children in a group is limited by the square footage of the space. In Head Start, there's a maximum of 20 children if they're 4 years old, or 17 if most children are age 3. And then for TK, the maximum is 24 if schools are receiving class size reduction funding. So again, just significant variation from program to program that are serving children of the same preschool age. We'll now move to staffing standards, and we'll start with lead teacher minimum qualifications. We're going to dig in more, I believe, as a working group next month to staffing. So right now we're just talking about what are the minimum requirements for programs. And of the standards, these are probably some of the most important and they're consequential for our programs in terms of hiring and the adults that are working with children. So TK has some of the most stringent teacher requirements. Teachers must have a teaching credential, and that requires at least a bachelor's degree and then completing a teacher preparation program, typically post-baccalaureate. And teachers also need to have 24 units of early childhood, a child development teacher permit, or equivalent experience as determined by the LEA starting in August of this year. And this will eventually also include the preschool to 3rd grade teaching credential once that is established. CSCP teachers, on the other hand, the minimum requirement is a child development associate permit. This means that they need to have at least 12 units of early childhood coursework and 50 days of experience. And then within 10 years, they need to have a teacher permit, which requires 24 units of ECE and some general education. And Judy is going to explain the Head Start requirements.
Head Start requires at least an associate's degree in early childhood ed, but at least 50% of teachers nationally must have a bachelor's degree. 60% of the Head Start lead teachers in California have their BA. If Head Start services are provided in partnership with the family child care provider, that provider must have a CDA or be enrolled in the CDA, an AA, or a BA program.
It is worth noting that there are many programs across the different funding streams where staff are credentialed above this minimum requirement. The majority of teachers have either an AA or a BA in ECE, even if it is not required. However, their pay remains about 50% of that compared to TK teachers.
Thank you, Nia. So assistant teacher minimum qualifications are significantly more unified across programs. There just aren't very many requirements. TK assistant teachers need to be at least 18 years old. And typically, because they assist in instruction, they are paraprofessionals. And so in Title I schools, they must also pass the basic skills test or have some college. In CSPP, assistant teachers simply need to be 18 years old and have a background check. And then in Head Start, requires assistant teachers to have a CDA credential or to be enrolled in a CDA, associate's or bachelor's program with completion of that credential within 18 months from the date of hire. So now the final piece that we'll look at is professional learning requirements. There are some requirements for professional learning, but we just want to acknowledge that most professional learning is driven by the available funding and staff needs. In TK, most professional learning is determined by the LEA and the local collective bargaining unit. CSPP, in addition to meeting licensing requirements, for example, mandatory reporting and CPR training, teachers must have at least 2 days of professional development per year, and programs need to identify key topics of support for staff. And Judy will explain Head Start's requirements.
So Head Start requires a minimum of 15 hours of training annually, as well as a coaching strategy for the education staff. Required topics of professional learning for Head Start education staff are curriculum, implementation, knowledge of the Head Start early learning outcomes framework, partnering with families, supporting children with disabilities and their families, providing effective and nurturing adult-child interactions, supporting dual language learners, addressing challenging behaviors, preparing children and families for transitions, and using data to individualize learning experiences. Head Start grantees do receive a separate funding amount that represents 25% of their base grant that is earmarked for professional learning. And some California Head Start programs are offering multiple pathways for their staff to attain credentials.
As outlined on the slide, state preschool programs offer 2 professional development days per year. These are limited to non-service days when the program is allowed to collect payment, even though children are not enrolled in service in that particular day. While this is much better than no professional development days, which was the case a number of years ago, this is not sufficient time for teachers to get training and support on child assessments, teaching, learning environments, anti-racist and anti-bias practices, and more. Ideally, there would be a comprehensive system of ongoing professional development with a focus on job-embedded coaching to support teachers with modeling developmentally appropriate practice. Additionally, the coaching would support best practice for utilizing child observations as an assessment tool as well as for learning.
So we have covered a lot of ground. To briefly sum up, there is a lot of variation across programs serving preschool age children, at least in terms of what are the minimum requirements. The licensing rules, as we described at the outset, set the foundation for health and safety. Head Start performance standards and Title V standards tend to be the most prescriptive when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion standards, as well as family and community engagement and the learning environment. And TK's requirements are the most prescriptive when it comes to teacher qualifications. We would really invite the working group to think about ways of finding alignment within equitable learning to make all learning environments equitable so that no matter where a child attends preschool, they have a similar opportunity or an equal opportunity to learn. And I know that there's lots of things that we didn't cover today too, so it really might be useful for us to take a look at kind of the broader landscape of what families want in addition to these standards and some of the standards that we weren't able to cover today. And Judy.
I'm sorry. What?
or Nina, any final thoughts? No need, Judy.
Yeah, it's very clear from all of the slides earlier that the benefit of quality early care and educations is really about adult to child interactions. As we've seen across the board, the professional development, the staffing, the qualifications wildly vary. And what my takeaway is that preschool teachers are overburdened with having to do it alone. They're left figuring it out by themselves, overwhelmed with a multitude of expectations and daily requirements. Teachers do need dedicated time to reflect and to prepare in order to be able to be as effective as they can. The Head Start model is the closest system that emulates a village approach and is thus often seen as a higher quality program over Title V. It is clear that early childhood education has gained recognition, that it is a dual support to help children learn while parents work. In order for this to happen, programs need funding to support quality work while paying living wages for teachers and support staff. I'll turn it back to you, Judy, if you have any closing remarks.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. I just got a little distracted. So Head Start is an essential component of any successful mixed delivery system. And the value of partnering with Head Start is the comprehensiveness of the program and the significant parent and community engagement components. Compared to other states, California Head Start programs have a high degree of collaboration with other early learning programs, whether that be state-funded pre-K, childcare partners, or other community service providers. It's not easy work, and Head Start standards can at times seem overwhelming to partners, but what such partnerships bring to children and families is worth the effort.
I think at this point, we're going to pass it to Virginia to talk about special considerations for family childcare.
Thank you so much. Is my audio working? I see people nodding. Perfect. Well, so thank you so much, everybody. So we'll just dive right in here. So there are really multiple types of state-funded family childcare home education networks, or FECHNs, in California. CDE administers FECHNs through our California State Preschool Program contract. DSS administers FECHNs through the General Child Care Contract, or CCTR, through the Migrant Child Care Contract, or CMIG, and through the Family Childcare Home Education Network Contract, or CFCC. While the quality components of these programs are mostly consistent, the reimbursement for these contracts varies starkly. Next slide. So what is a FECHN, or Family Childcare Home Education Network? This is an entity that's organized under law that contracts either with the State Department of Education, CDE, or with the Department of Social Services, DSS, and to make payments to licensed family childcare home providers and to provide educational and support services to those providers and to children and families eligible for state subsidized early learning services. California Education Code Section 8223 addresses FECHN requirements for CDE programs, while the Welfare and Institutions Code Section 10250 addresses FECHN requirements for DSS programs. These FECHNs offer supports to providers to help them meet quality requirements and do improvements through shared service networks, coaching, and mentoring opportunities. While FECHN agencies provide the case management services to enroll and recruit families, they are also required to provide specific early education program support to all providers in the network. FECHN program staff work in partnership with providers to actively demonstrate learning, care, and teaching materials and methods to enhance providers' awareness and leverage lived experiences of quality program elements to elevate Title V requirements. These FECHNs offer provider orientation about this program type and ongoing training and technical support of all providers within the network. Next slide. So we've included this chart to lay out the similarities and differences for reimbursement between each type of FECHN. When we look at reimbursement to contractors, CDE reimburses the state preschool or CSPP contractor the contract rate for CSPP, which includes the 5% admin costs. For CCTR and CMIG, CDSS reimburses the contractors the contract rate for each of these respective contracts, which also includes the 15% admin costs. However, CFCC contractors are reimbursed for provider payments, which are the regional market rate for the county they are serving children in, plus 30% administrative and support cost allowance. The major impact to how this changes the provider reimbursement is that for CSPP, CCTR, and CMIG FECHNs, the administrative fee is taken out of the provider's reimbursement. And for CFCC contracts, the admin and support costs are allocated to the contractor in addition to the provider's reimbursement. Next slide. So when we look at what that means for provider payments, we see that for CSPP, CCTR, and CMIG, sometimes the provider's payments are less than the 75th percentile of the 2018 regional market rate. This happens in counties where the contract rate is at the 75th percentile, meaning providers may receive up to 15% less than the regional market rate. However, in places where the contract rate is higher than the 75th percentile, contractors may receive the 75th percentile or something else higher. For CFCC contracts, provider payments are never going to be less than the 75th percentile of the regional market rate. Next slide. Here's a provider payment example with a 30% administrative and support costs allowed for a CFCC contract. So here, for the example is in Alameda County, contractors are reimbursed $2,268.26 per month, where the full-time monthly reimbursement based off the RMR ceilings are $1,587.78. So what you're seeing is that the contractor is receiving up to $780 per month for administrative and support costs, and the provider is receiving the remainder of that $2,268, which is $1,587.78 a month. A provider payment example with the 15% administrative costs, and this is again for CSPP, CCTR, and CMIG. So contractors in this case are reimbursed based off of a per child daily rate. So we'll pick the same county, Alameda. The per child rate is $79.39 a day, or about $1,500 a month, assuming 20 working days in a month. This daily rate is intended to cover administrative costs and the daily cost of providing services to the child. So in this example, the contractor can retain almost $12 a day, which is almost $240 a month, assuming 20 working days, to cover their administrative costs. The provider would receive about $67 per day, or about $13.49 a month, assuming 20 working days in the month. So the amount of administrative and support costs that the contractor receives, it directly impacts the Fetchins' ability to provide additional supports for providers. All state-funded contractors are limited to using 15% of their allotted admin and support costs toward administration of the program. The remainder is used to supporting the providers in the network. Higher support costs ensure Fetchins contractors have funding to provide more professional development for their family childcare home providers that are meeting the higher quality requirements of Title V. CFCC contractors are able to use an additional 15% of their total contract to help provide those additional supports for providers on top of what CSPP, CCTR, and CMIG contractors are able to provide. So how are the administrative and support costs are allocated? That directly impacts the provider's payments. As we just showed in the previous examples, when the administrative and support costs are taken from the total child reimbursement, as in CSPP, CCTR, and CMIG contracts, the provider does not receive the full per child rate. When the administrative and support costs are allocated in addition to the per child rate, then the providers get the full per child rate, and contractors are still able to retain funds for administration and support. I think I am now handing it back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia. And I believe that Stephen Profiter from CDE wanted to add one additional point.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, just to add on, we heard a lot of different models of reimbursement for Fetchins. One thing we wanted to clarify is that the rules around which contracts use which different funding models is set in, it's provided in statute. It's not something that departments have the authority to say, switch to use this model or that model. It would require some kind of a legislative change.
Thank you so much for that clarification. And thank you all for the wonderful presentation and really helpful and foundational information for this work group discussion. And want to kind of move us into our discussion session now. And over the next 25 minutes or so, 20 minutes, We're going to be discussing what is the current status of quality, both with standards and practice within California's mixed delivery model. And what we'll do is encourage workgroup members to raise their hand if they would like to provide verbal remarks. You are also able to continue using discourse for written remarks. And to the extent possible, please keep your remarks to about 2 minutes so that we can hear from as many folks as possible. So are there any workgroup members that would like to provide remarks? And Tina Green, I see your hand. And please, if you don't mind turning your video on, that way we can spotlight you for the group.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
If I was just to take one word, I would say it's very inconsistent. You have the early childhood sector that is most programs adhere to quality rating standards, whereas some of those standards, excuse me, are not fluid in, for example, a TK program. So to me, it's very inconsistent in terms of how we may perceive quality. And when I say we, I'm referring to family child care programs as well as center-based programs, and then how it is implemented and what it looks like in Head Start, state preschool, as well as TK. It all looks different.
Thank you. And Nancy, I see your hand raised.
You know, as I have hard copies of these PowerPoints, so I'm going back to the slides that reflect all of the different standards for Head Start, state preschool, and TK. And for me, yes, I understand it's complex and we all live this world, but what would be really helpful, I think, to also provide a context for the varying requirements of each program and the standards that are required would be to look at the actual reimbursement. The ADA reimbursement for TK is different from the reimbursement for state preschool. I know with Head Start, it's even more complex because depending on the grantee in California, the reimbursement rate varies from grantee to grantee, so that it's just another layer of complexity that factors into this. And just as the Fetchin slides highlighted the reimbursement rates, I think it's part of the equation or part of the discussion. So I think that information would be helpful. And perhaps if there's a way to at least get an average of what state preschool reimbursement rates are, at least here in California, that might be helpful.
Great. So the first comment we heard about kind of inconsistency across different settings.
Yeah, that's a given.
And it sounds like what you're calling for is additional information to really better understand kind of why some of that inconsistency might be happening. So we can look at pulling that information together and making that available in the future. Thanks so much for that comment.
Thank you.
And next, I'm going to go ahead and call on Radha Bala. Encourage you to turn your video on, please. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Let me lower my hand. There we go. Hi, everybody. So I had a couple of questions. I am a preschool special ed teacher at a local district. I've been doing this for about 15 plus years. So a couple of my questions, just for clarification. One was the concept of ratios. And I know that we're used to looking at things in terms of class size, but for special education, it's really important to look at it in terms of a caseload and a workload. And that was one thing. And I know that there's Head Start has 10% population is special needs. I understand, but it's really, really crucial that we have a educator in the classroom that is very much trained specifically on how to deal with children with special needs. And that was one of the 2 points I had. And then, well, that was pretty much most of it, was the ratio. It's really, really important to look at ratio and using the right terminology, caseload rather than class size. And making sure that people who are working with our most vulnerable special ed kids are qualified. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that important point. And I think that lifts up a thread that's going on in the discourse around thinking about ratios differently for children with disabilities and really making sure we're embedding inclusive practices as we think about practice of those standards. Dr. Deidre Jones, I see your hand raised.
Yes, I would just like to add that the standards and practice that you see in Fetchin, CSPP, Head Start, as well as community-based organizations, as well as those that are just governed by Title 22 Child Care Licensing Standards, are very play-based and focus on age and developmentally appropriateness as defined within the field of early childhood education. But when it comes to TK, it appears to be mostly academic based, as is defined, as we can see in the definition of TK, it being a first year of a 2-year kindergarten program, as well as it was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I believe, about the curriculum that's supposed to be used with TK, that it is a modified kindergarten curriculum that is supposed to be aligned in terms of age and developmentally appropriateness with the preschool learning foundations. So you have those differences there where TK tends to still lean towards the K through 5 system, and it's looked at as a watered down kindergarten program rather than the true preschool program that it's purporting to be. So you have those differences there where you have very play-based versus academic-driven.
So I hear an idea of wanting to make sure that we are developmentally appropriate across the different settings and in practice. Thank you so much for that comment. And I see Odakonda, your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to underline since we are implementing UPK to start from the age 3, and we know, most of us know that the age 3 is when the kid starts either speaking or understanding, like, directions and motivation of doing stuff. And we are in the play base. I'll say early educators are in the play base mode, but it doesn't stop us to start introducing the learning, since the system is set by the state. So that doesn't tell us that we had to wait till when they are 4 or 5 to start knowing the colors, to start knowing to say something or ask something, or to start knowing that this is A, to start decoding the alphabetic system. And also the standard had to be the same, because if I move a Head Start, and Head Start give me more, more motivation, or give me more material supply to help my kids. And they are from 0 to whatever age the Head Start is giving to me. And another provider or educator have a setting that is not involved with Head Start. And those kids are not getting the same material or education system that I'm giving. And those kids will go to public school. So when we hand them from the community to the school, we can see the inequity right there, because that child that comes from Head Start system will know everything and will have less challenge in school. And this child that didn't know anything, that was just playing and sleeping or whatever, will have the problem. It will be like this is the first time that they're entering the education system. So if the state or Department of Education can be involved in giving us books, material, that everybody on the same level, that have the same kind of children or age, given the same material, I think it's gonna be very good, because all those kids, when they go to school, they're gonna show that they have something already that's embedded in the cognitive and physical development. And the third thing is the ratio. Some people have 1/8 ratio, some 6/1, some 12, some 14. Large daycare and some preschool have 14 and 20. So if you are one person that's gonna have 20 kids, I bet those kids won't learn anything because they are small, they had to be catered, and it's a lot of work. And if we had to hire more teacher or helper, which means we have less money to give out there, to keep to ourselves, to run our program. And the fourth is the standard of entry had to be set by Department of Education. They had to be set across the board. If you're gonna cater kids 0 to 2, this is the level of education. If you're gonna cater kids from 2 to 5, this is the level of education. If you're gonna cater this age to this age, this is the level. So that means everybody had to be able to know the age group they wanna serve, and given the requirement from Department of Education, we will know how to pick and choose the kid that we wanna serve. And the kids, when they are served for the person that is capable of doing it, when they go to school, from a UPK to PK to kindergarten, they will be ready because the person was ready for them, and they have given them what they need to go to the ladder of from UPK 3 to 4 and 5 to school. So I think that's what I think we had to do. Otherwise, it's not going to be equity. It will be non-equity because some kid will be smarter, will have more knowledge, and some won't. And when they go to school, we're going to have the same problem with teacher that will complain that this group of kids just came from home and they don't know nothing. And this group of kids are prepared to go to school. And also, if the UPK is going to be universal, as they are saying, then everybody that have a child that's 3 years old will have to have a free care from that age, so the kid can have at least 2 years of preparation for them to enter kindergarten. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. You covered a lot of ground there. Some of the key points I heard you say had to do with kind of infusing concepts of learning into play-based activities, making sure there's kind of adequate resources to have that high quality across settings, thinking about the importance of ratios and how that impacts high quality, and also thinking about kind of the standards of entry and making sure that students are ready for whatever is coming next. I'm going to try to call on names that I haven't seen speak yet today. So I'm going to go to Elsa Jacobson, and then we have room for maybe 1 or 2 more comments after that.
Thanks so much. I was just going to mention that one of the factors we might look at in the crosswalk, and I apologize if this was already covered, is hours of the day that a program is offered, because we know that in so many cases, children need full day care, and also the sort of whether it's full year care that's available through the programs, or only through the school year, to make sure that we're looking at family access and essentially the hours and the length of time that fit with family needs and family work schedules. And I also wonder if it would be instructive as part of the crosswalk to look at Title 22 standards with some of the same elements, because we do know that 3 and 4-year-olds are also in general child care programs. They're also in AP programs. And so to look at the settings in which all of our 3 and 4-year-olds are currently situated, what the teacher qualifications are, what the environmental standards are, and so forth, even if they're not as involved as in the other programs that we mentioned, or that were mentioned rather.
Yeah, so thinking about additional information that will be helpful for the work group to consider as we understand the context across different settings. Okay, unfortunately, we have time for just 1 more hand raised at this point. So Dr. LaWanda Wesley, I'm going to hand it over to you, and then I encourage anybody else who has their hand raised to please share your comments via Discourse so we can keep the conversation moving.
Sure. I think we just still need to back up a little bit and just think about who we're really talking about. We're talking about our youngest children, our youngest students across the board in all of these settings. And we know from all the research that play-based pedagogy is what young children need. We know in other countries, they're not experiencing education the same way that we're trying to do it here. And they really allow children to be children. And with that said, we still have a responsibility to put a framework, use some measure of quality standards. But I think Head Start is definitely where we should all be marching towards, because it includes not only the play-based pedagogy, but it has safety, it has professional development. And whether you're a family childcare provider or a center-based provider or private or community, if we were sitting side by side as adults who are touching the lives of children in the realm called care and education, then we would know then we were doing the same standards, because we would be doing it together. So I just think we just need to back up a little bit and really think about who we are. The definition of quality across all systems has been one of the toughest things. We try to answer. All the literature review says how difficult it is, but we have an opportunity with the UPK group to really sit down and do the really hard work. And I want to keep mentioning that we have to have specific cultural connection indicators that says kids are being affirmed. That's not woven throughout any of our systems. Head Start probably does the best at it, but we can even do better. That should be a measure of quality. And when those cultural connection indicators are not there, we're not addressing full quality. So that's all I wanted to say and share as we close out.
Thank you so much for uplifting the opportunity that we have and some specific suggestions around making sure we're attentive to culture. Well, thank you all for a great discussion. And we know that 20 minutes is not enough time to get into everything, but really encourage you to continue the discussion in discourse. And thank you all for those of you who provided insightful comments over the last few minutes. And now I am going to hand it over to Maggie Stapley, who is going to introduce our next session.
Thanks, Keelan. We're moving into the home stretch of our meeting here, and really looking forward to have an opportunity to do some synthesis as we move into this next space. Our final segment for the day focuses on data and maps synthesized and created by a team at UC Berkeley to help us better understand the current distribution of preschool programs in the state and to look at issues of access. Joining us to talk through these maps is Dr. Bruce Fuller from UC Berkeley. Dr. Fuller and his research team developed a video with a detailed presentation on these maps and the methodology that they used to create them. And this was posted on California Educators Together at the start of the week. We know many of you were able to take a look at that. So today he will be highlighting the high-level takeaways from this mapping process. And Dr. Fuller's team will also be providing additional information for our meeting in April. I would encourage workgroup members, if you had any questions about what you may have seen in the video that doesn't get covered in the high-level overview by Dr. Fuller today, please put those questions in discourse and we can answer them there. The presentation and maps today specifically inform the guiding question, what is the current distribution of programs across California, and how does this vary across the state? When we get into our discussion question, however, we want to have a conversation to synthesize reflections across all of the key questions that we looked at today. With that, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Bruce Fuller.
Thanks, Maggie, and thanks to Maggie and Emily for all the fine organizing for today. 3 hours into the meeting, you may be itching to jump outside or search for a glass of wine. So I promise to be brief, and I'm going to show mainly pictures and not talk so much at you. Our task, as Maggie just said, is to try to help the work group understand the organizational landscape of this mixed delivery network. And today's presentation is a start at that. And again, more detailed presentation is online, as Maggie mentioned. Next slide. So let's just remember and recall the motivating question for the work group, which is how to expand access to high quality pre-K. And so why do we want to define the organizational landscape? How does this task help the work group pursue its core essential question? First of all, we need to know where the 3- and 4-year-olds reside in the state, where there might be concentrations of kids. We obviously want to build quality supply where youngsters are located, and the demography of the state is somewhat fluid and has changed over the last 30 or 40 years. Secondly, we want to discover how 4 different pre-K subsectors serve different families and different communities. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of weaving together locally. As you all know on the work group, but these 4 subsectors do, in a sense, occupy different positions on the map, literally and figuratively. Also, we want to pinpoint regions and communities that suffer from limited family access, so-called hotspots. And fourthly, we want to take into account this organizational landscape as the work group is devising policy options, considering how to improve both access to mixed delivery as well as the quality across these 4 subsectors. Next slide. So first, a quick overview. These are enrollments from 2021. The data are provided both by CDE as well as the Head Start Administration and the Child Care Resource and Referral Network in San Francisco, the R&R network. These are raw, rounded counts of enrollments across the 4 subsectors that we're focused on here at Berkeley. CSPP enrolled last year about 92,000, or in 2021, 92,000 youngsters, part-time, part-day or full-day. TK was at about 81,000. The department's just revising this figure upward for the fall of 2022, probably at around 90, 91,000. Head Start enrolled about 86,000. And then what we're calling the tuition charging sector, that is pre-K centers serving 3 and 4-year-olds that charge fees. The reported capacity is about 386,000 slots. This is reported by local R&Rs, as many of you know, and that comes up through the network. Next month, we'll give you a glimpse at the license capacity, because we can compare the network's reported data from CDSS's license capacity data. But this is a pretty solid count of license capacity in 2021 for 3 and 4-year-olds. Next slide, please. Without going into the weeds on this late in the day, we do want to just emphasize that for some programs, we can estimate enrollment rates for 3 and 4-year-olds. That is, what percentage of 3s and 4s are enrolled in a pre-K center. And we can do this for the state, we can do this for zip codes, we can do this for school districts. And I'm going to show you some pictures in just a couple of minutes to illustrate this. When it comes to tuition charging or fee charging pre-K programs, we have to rely on capacity, because at this point we don't know actual enrollments in this 4 subsector. So we calculate maximum capacity the pre-K fee charging sector can serve, their maximum capacity, as a percentage of all 3 and 4-year-olds. But this is capacity, not actual enrollment rates. The other thing we're going to try to do in April is to look at enrollment rates for eligible kids, because of course for CSPP and Head Start, we want to know what percentage of 3 and 4s who are eligible are actually enrolling in those 2 programs. So these are more specific drill downs that we'll present in April. Next slide. So we can estimate these enrollment rates. These are somewhat tentative, but we did want to share these with you. If you estimate how many 3 and 4-year-olds in CSPP are currently enrolled in part-day or full-day, it's about 11%. If you try to approximate percent of 3 and 4s who are eligible to enroll, and you look at under 200% of poverty, the enrollment rate is quite a bit higher, as you would suspect. It's about 40%. So over time, since the 1960s, CSPP has really reached out and extended into a vast number of communities and is enrolling about 2/5 of low-income youngsters. Head Start is about 10%, additional 10% of 3 and 4-year-olds. TK now enrolls about 15 to 18% of all just 4-year-olds, of course. And tuition charging privates have the capacity, the maximum capacity to enroll 39% of all 3s and 4s. Again, this is their maximum capacity if they filled their classrooms as reported by these programs through the R&Rs. Next slide. So where are the 3 and 4-year-olds in California? If you put your glasses on and try to read this legend, it'll simply tell you that the darker areas are higher concentrations of 3 and 4-year-olds. As you might expect, there are bigger chunks, bigger populations of 3s and 4s in the Central Valley, but we also see large shares of 3 and 4-year-olds as a percentage of the total population in the Inland Empire, north of Los Angeles, and in part of the mid-coastal areas south of Monterey. So again, as we think about expanding access to quality pre-K, we want to take into account these concentrations of where youngsters actually reside. Next slide. So just to show you some pictures of how we can visualize differences in enrollment rates, on the left-hand side, we've mapped the CSPP enrollment rate by zip code. And again, the darker colors are where we have higher enrollment rates for CSPP. The good news is we have fairly high enrollment rates in parts of the Central Valley where low-income kids are concentrated. We have lower enrollment rates in other communities, in part the coastal communities, which are higher income, and we have lower shares of low-income families. So in a way, this is quite good news because CSPP over time has targeted appropriately into lower income areas. At the same time, on the right-hand side, we've mapped the raw counts of 3 and 4-year-olds not served by CSPP. These help us get to this hotspot idea or pre-K deserts, if you will. So the darker areas here now are zip codes with higher raw counts of 3 and 4-year-old children that are not enrolled in CSPP. And we see some of these darker areas in the southern part of the Central Valley, south of Bakersfield. We also see some underserved communities in Monterey County, moving towards Salinas, and in parts of the middle coastal areas, the Central Coast. Next slide. We can dig down further, and in these maps, we've looked at 4-year-olds who are not enrolled in TK or CSPP. And the short story is we see basically the same areas. The same areas that are short on CSPP tend to be short on TK programs as well. Carla Bryant and others in the community have talked about how the enrollment rates of TK may track against enrollment rates of CSPP because you have experts, you have staff in school districts and NGOs ready to expand TK, you have that infrastructure. And these maps tend to reinforce that hypothesis that CSPP tends to provide infrastructure, which is then built upon for TK and other programs. And where we have shortages of CSPP coverage, we have shortages of TK. Next slide. This map shows a quite different picture. This is a similar plot, a little bit different format, but this is a plot of where reported enrollment capacity in tuition charging private pre-Ks is low or high. So again, the darker blues are zip codes that have relatively high capacity, high enrollment capacity as reported by R&Rs in tuition charging private pre-Ks. And what's starkly different here is that this enrollment capacity is considerably higher in wealthier coastal areas. And in a sense, this isn't surprising because this is where families have the purchasing power to go into the market, so to speak, and buy into fee charging pre-K programs. They're buying into that large capacity that's out there in the private sector. On the other hand, in the Central Valley, where we saw larger enrollments in CSPP, we have much lower capacity in the purely market subsector. Next slide. This is just a graph which sort of sharpens the point a little bit. On the left-hand side, we've basically split all the state's zip codes by household income. So on the far bar that says 13%, that's the lowest third of all zip codes in terms of family income in the state. Their CSPP enrollment is 13% of all 3 and 4-year-olds. The dark bar that says 4%, only 4% of all 3 and 4-year-olds are enrolled in high income zip codes. Again, this is really good news in the sense that CSPP historically has been targeted on lower income families and their youngsters, and that is what you can see in this display. The flip side is tuition charging private pre-Ks. The low income, the third of all zip codes with the lowest income in the state, their capacity is 26%. But in the highest third, in terms of family income, the most well-off zip codes in California, their enrollment capacity is 70% of all 3 and 4-year-olds. For TK, there's slight differences, and those differences on the right-hand side are not statistically significant, meaning the TK has expanded since 2010, 2012, relatively evenly across low, middle, and high income zip codes. And we can get more into this in April. So how do these patterns inform policy options that you all, the workforce members, will start devising in the spring? How does this landscape analysis, understanding the distribution of pre-K organizations, how does it help generate and provoke important policy options? First of all, taking into account where the 3- and 4-year-olds reside, are we serving those communities, mainly in the Inland Empire, the far north, the Central Valley, where we have the heaviest concentration of 3- and 4-year-olds? Are we getting our infrastructure built in those communities? Historically, it's been the Bay Area, LA, San Diego. Historically, those have been the places with the best infrastructure, the best capacity to bid for CSPP contracts, to organize around TK, to build Head Start. But the kids are not necessarily in the communities that historically have had the strongest infrastructure. The other point is just to keep in mind these 4 pre-K subsectors are positioned differently, and they serve different communities to some extent. In April, we're going to present for you some of the same distributional maps for family childcare homes. Pre-K access is highly constrained, as you just saw in the pictures, mostly in the Central Valley, the Central Coast, south of Bakersfield, north of LA. These are communities with scarce supply. CSPP and enrollments also remain low in the far north in policy conversation. And public sector, for equity reasons, for racial justice reasons, we don't want to lose track of this relatively large capacity that's still provided by the private subsector. And as CSPP becomes more open to middle-class populations, families just under the state median income, we're going to start to see some more overlap between CSPP and the purely private sector. So we want to keep in our minds and our hearts all 4 of these subsectors as we try to broaden access to quality pre-K. Maggie, I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Really appreciate the information and the maps, and glad that we can start digging into some data today as work group members have requested, but obviously we'll continue this throughout the rest of our time together as a work group. We only have about 10 minutes or so to have verbal questions, comments, feedback from the work group at this point. So we'll get right into it with the hope to kind of give us space to offer some synthesizing thoughts from what we've heard today in relation to the data that we've seen. We also, as mentioned before, welcome additional thoughts in discourse, and we'll have an opportunity to continue to unpack this data in April. Gloria, I see your hand up. I will pass it over to you.
Great. Dr. Fuller, incredibly valuable analysis, so thank you for that. I guess I had a question. The whole time I was looking at the data, I kept wondering about census tracts and about, I know you use zip codes, but I wondered about census tract and if there is sort of the growing sense, at least in a lot of the urban core, that for the next 5-10 years, which is really kind of where we need to be looking, sort of the migration patterns that are being observed in the state. So I'm curious about why zip codes and not census tracts is a question I'm sure that you probably thought about. And then the second is whether there's any value or any way of thinking about kind of population growth as a way of looking at this data and anticipating where children will be as we think about building out capacity.
Should I go ahead, Maggie?
Yeah, go ahead. Maybe you could just very briefly answer the zip data question.
Yeah, 2 great questions. One is on the first, administrative agencies like CDE and the Child Care Resource and Referral Network maintain data by zip code. But you're right, if we can get down to more granular units, that would be ideal. And secondly, I think it's a great idea to project population and try to map some of the same distributions based upon estimated population growth. it's a great idea. We just haven't gotten to it yet.
Data wish lists that we can start to build together. And I see a couple questions coming in for you, Dr. Fuller, on discourse. So if you're able to respond on that platform, that would be fantastic. And I invite other work group members that want to participate verbally to raise their hand. We would love to hear from particularly folks we maybe haven't heard from yet today. Tony Jordan, I invite you to jump in.
Thank you. Yeah, I know you've heard from me already today, but I posed a question in the dialogue, a little technical, probably a little bit in the weeds for where we're at now, and now knowing that April will have a little bit more time for this, but I just wanted to, thank you for putting this data together. I found it to be extremely valuable. The just under half-hour preview that we were able to access was incredibly insightful, and these data that you presented, I really think will help guide our work as we look at access and quality, and what I know you called hotspots, or what a lot of us have been around a while call the childcare deserts. I found it extremely important, especially with the tuition, or what I would refer to as private pay. And really that to me looks like a very underutilized resource in our whole mixed delivery system. So I'm really interested to see how we can, better address, full usage of what capacity is truly out there and available for our UPK mixed delivery system. So thanks again for the great data and presentation. Look forward to more of this in April.
Thanks, Tony. Also, Aaron just flagged the question that fee-for-service tuition charging programs may well serve children financed with vouchers. And that's something we've been trying to dig into. So it's a really good corrective comment, because a lot of these so-called private programs do serve a public purpose in terms of low-income kids in some cases. We're trying to get a clear fix on that. So thanks, Aaron, for flagging that.
Thanks, and lots of complexities in terms of what we're looking at and how we're presenting the data. So appreciate these clarifications coming up in discourse. Elsa, I'll give you the mic.
Thank you. Yes, I was just curious to know if you had looked at all, and it may be too early to tell, I think, because TK expansion really has been ramping up over the last year, and then that will continue to be the case. But how much, if at all, TK expansion has impacted the trends you're seeing of families utilizing CSPP, utilizing private pay programs, et cetera? Have you looked at how TK expansion might be influencing some of those trends? Or if you haven't, are you possibly planning to do so in the next year or so, given the plans to expand UPK, particularly through TK?
Also, I want to not keep handing it back and forth to get all these questions answered, because I guess I would probably put that in our ongoing data wish list question. So I'll flag that as a ongoing need, and if we have looked at it, then we'll bring it back, and if we haven't, we'll put it on our wish list. But I think it's a really great question, and you're raising some really important points for our group to think about how these patterns might shift as we move towards full implementation of TK, and how that should affect the work group's recommendations. I want to see if we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left in this topic space before we open it up for our last round of public comment. I will go to Jennifer, and then we'll probably have time for 1 or 2 more comments after that.
I just wanted to say I appreciated the data and the breakdown of the data, because it kind of tied into what we were talking about earlier with PK and like equitable versus equity and equal, and where are the gaps and what are the services being provided. So I feel like it helps at least provide a framework for us to look at, to know what type of things we need to put in different areas and kind of look at, so that we can be strategic with what we're wanting to build across at the state level. So anyways, I just kind of wanted to mention that.
Totally agree, Jennifer. I think that's a great point. I'll add that Dr. Fuller's slides, including some high resolution versions of these graphics, are available on California Educators Together. We encourage the workgroup members to spend more time with this data. And as we do eventually move into our co-construction of recommendations, we would love for you to be referencing back to this in terms of the recommendations that you're making. Time for one more comment, I think. So I'll see if there's anyone else that would like to raise a hand and jump in here. Otakanda?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Filler. According to the data that you present to us and all the area that is concentrated for children of 4 and 3 years old, so what the state is gonna do, are they gonna build or are they gonna depend on what infrastructure they have to continue to utilizing them, or where are we going? What is the approach? Are we gonna just, I don't understand. Are we gonna use it in school? Or is it gonna be in the community? Are we gonna add more, like building for that for the 3 and 4 years old? That's my question.
Just to clarify, Arakanda, are you asking how is the state gonna use the data that Dr. Fuller just produced or presented?
Yes, yeah, use it and compare to what we want to do, the UPK. So are those the data is gonna help to add more infrastructure or school or preschool, or because we are adding more people that were out of the school system in. So that population of those kids, how are we gonna cater them?
I think that I'll jump in here with the answer, which is to say that we've asked Dr. Fuller to present this data for the work group to use in the development of its recommendations, particularly around the work group's charge around access. And so as Jennifer just jumped in, kind of looking at these hotspots, if you will, and thinking about where the work group might like to make recommendations to the CDE to direct maybe future investments or to think about kind of enrollment priorities, et cetera. So I think the answer is we're going to use it, and Otakanda will look to you and to your colleagues on the work group to tell us how we can use it to inform our recommendations. With that, I'm going to conclude what was just scratching the surface of some data questions here. We invite you to continue to put your questions in discourse or to email the UPK mixed delivery inbox if there are additional questions that we can pass along to Dr. Fuller or that we can explore together in April. And we will have much more time in April and in future months to begin using this data in the crafting of our recommendations. And with that, we will now move into the second public comment portion of this meeting, which will be facilitated again by my colleague, Sienna Chambers.
All righty, hello again. We are now in the second round of public comment, where the public is encouraged to provide verbal and written public comments on the second agenda item. I do want to note that the CDE and members of the CDE staff are not able to respond to statements and questions made during public comment. For written public comment, again, we are using Google Forms. To access the public comment, you can use the QR code on the slide or enter the URL glenpricegroup.com/UPK-MDQA in your web browser. We also have a pinned, Emily Esteban's screen is pinned with the QR code also to make it easy for everyone to access the public comment. To submit your public comment, you will need to enter your name on the Google form. Please remember all public comments will be posted and available for everyone to see, both as your comments come up on Google Forms and after the meeting as part of the public record. So we kindly ask that you uphold standards of professionalism. The Google form will remain open until 1 hour after the end of the work group meeting. We will now take verbal public comments. While you are welcome to ask questions, they will not be answered, but will be captured for the public record. If you would like to make a verbal public comment, please use the raised hand function in the participant panel, and we will call on you to unmute yourself. Please state your full name and any affiliation you may have for the public record. To maximize the number of speakers, we ask that verbal public comments are kept to 1 minute. We can see a display timer is somewhat up on my screen, and hopefully it'll start to work in a couple of seconds. You will receive a warning sound when there are 10 seconds remaining. And then for fairness, if your comments exceed the 1 minute mark, we will have to mute you and move on. We encourage you to submit comments that exceed the 1 minute mark in the Google form. All righty. And with that, give me a moment. Oh, apologize for that. All right, at this point, there seems to be some technical difficulties with the timer, but that is perfectly fine. We're just gonna go ahead and continue. So at this point, members of the public, if you would like to make a verbal public comment, please raise your hand and you'll be called on and you'll be unmuted to make your public comment. So if we take a look at the pin screen of Caitlin, we have our timer. So again, if there are any members of the public who would like to make a verbal public comment, please use the raise hand function and we will call on you. Again, any members of the public, there was a mountain of information shared today through the wonderful presentations. We also had a lot of insight from work group members, both verbally and in the discourse chat that the members of the public were able to view today. So if there are any members of the public that would like to make a verbal public comment, okay. As I'm still not seeing any hands, I'll make one more request for public comment. And if we don't see any hands, we will assume that we are definitely using the written public comment, which is what we want. And then we will continue on. So again, last request for verbal public comment. All righty. And with that, we are closing the second round of public comment. The written public comment will remain open until 1 hour after the end of the work group meeting. I will now pass it back to Maggie.
Thanks, Sienna. Well, we are seeing public comment come in through the written platform. And as Sienna said, we welcome that public comment over the next hour. We are nearing the end of the March UPK Mixed Delivery Quality and Access meeting. Workgroup members are welcome to share additional reflections on today's agenda items in discourse also for another hour after the meeting. I would also encourage workgroup members to scan back through the discourse channel and threads and mark any comments that you want to indicate your agreement with or show your support for with that heart button to indicate kind of you agree. That is one of the ways that we are looking for as much agreement across the group as possible. As a few next steps moving forward, we will continue as we did today at the beginning of the workgroup meetings to provide verbal summaries on the progress of the workgroup. Written meeting summaries, including all public comments, are shared 2 weeks after each workgroup meeting on the California Educators Together website. We encourage you to check that website frequently for materials we'll be discussing at our next meeting and to stay up to date. We also remind you that all materials are formally introduced in the workgroup meetings, but if you do want to review them in advance or have more time with them in advance, you can go to that California Educators Together UPK Mixed Delivery Quality and Access group. As we did today, you can expect to find deeper dive presentation videos on the websites before workgroup meetings in the future in order to allow us to dedicate more time in the meeting to workgroup discussion. So we hope to continue to use that strategy. Finally, as Shanna mentioned earlier at the start of our meeting, DPG will be posting a timeline of the draft development process for the report that the CDE will be developing for the legislature and the Department of Finance. The timeline will give workgroup members and members of the public an indication of when they can expect to advise and comment on key documents and drafts. As always, the workgroup meets on the fourth Thursday of the month from 12:30 to 4:30. All meetings will have a virtual option at least through June of 2023. And our next 3 meetings will be on April 27th, May 25th, and June 22nd. With that, I'm going to be handing it back to the CDE and to the Early Education Division to close us out today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maggie. So first, I want to start by saying thank you for the excellent facilitation for the whole team at GPG. And of course, thank you for the informative presentations that uplifted the perspectives and voices of families, shared critical information, and elevated new ways of visualizing and using data to inform our understanding of access. We really look forward to being able to go deeper with these data to really get at the percentage of eligible children served and get that sense of the deserts and how to address those gaps. I'd also like to share my gratitude for the robust engagement from our impressive collection of workgroup members who really bring not just a diversity of voice, but perspectives and experiences which strengthen these critical conversations. We heard some clear themes today that I'd like to reflect back now. So first, we clearly heard the role of community, culture, and systems from state policy to quality improvement to local infrastructure, and how that ultimately impacts families, educators, and of course, the children who are at the center of our mission here and who we wouldn't be here without. We also heard that families are confused about what their options are and how to access them. And although we at the CDE are actively working to support better and more extensive communications, we look forward to recommendations about how to improve that work and leverage local partners to make sure these messages truly reach all parents, not just those who have existing connections. We also heard that access to information is the first, but far from the only barrier to authentic and equitable access to high quality pre-kindergarten learning experiences. And we look forward to exploring how to better address all of these barriers in the coming months. We also heard concern about the need to ensure that young children are getting play-based learning experiences, as well as the need to establish clear expectations around the learning and preparation that all children should have access to. So we at CDE want to make sure that all UPK settings are truly reflecting the science of learning and development, which tells us that embedding opportunities for play in the classroom routine is important to help create a more equitable learning environment for all children. A continuum of play-based learning activities, not only free play, but that are facilitated by skilled educators, is critical to support children's learning and development across cognitive, social, emotional, and physical domains. So just finally, as I close out, thank you again to the presenters, the work group members, and the public for your time and thought partnership as we work to build a stronger and more equitable UPK mixed delivery system in California.
Thanks so much, Steve. And with that, we'll conclude this meeting of the work group. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Recording stopped.